Ladies and gentlemen,
Hi, my name's Vermin Supreme.
welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Generally known as a
For
person who's
fun.
running for president.
I'm a friendly fascist. I am a tyrant that you should trust, and you should let me run your life, because I too know what is best for you.
This is
I'm
Vermin
a fringe
Supreme.
candidate. That means I'm running for president of America. Of course, on any given year, literally several hundred people are running for president, but you don't generally hear about them. But this year things, got a little different, and I literally blew up. Well, figuratively blew up. I guess I didn't literally blow up, of course.
Have you heard of this guy?
When did I become a meme? I would say it started on December 19th last year. It was at the lesser known candidate debate.
I'm asking you right now, do you still stand by your pledge made in 2008 to provide a pony for every American?
Yes, I do, sir. Free ponies for all Americans.
I do it and people, it seemed to very much resonate with the people. But that very night, I glitter bombed. Had the pleasure of glitter bombing homophobe and fetus fetishist Randall Terry.
Jesus told me to make Randall Terry gay with magic sprinkle dust.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Supreme.
And it was that night after I had sprinkled the magic fairy dust on him to turn him gay, Jesus having told me so. My friend Jimmy had shot that because I was able to bring a few people into the audience that night, and we put that out on the internet as quick as we could. And that went out in the tens of
Look at his
thousands,
boots.
maybe. But then by the time that C-SPAN eventually ran the actual debate, it did in fact go viral. For me, it became a meme when the image and likeness started to be appropriated and started to be used in various artistic projects.
Turning gay, turning gay. Thank you. All right. Turning gay. And all the ungays melting away.
And being a meme is a very curious and interesting phenomenon. It means that I am now
My hat is a boot.
bigger and larger and exist.
So just wanted to set that as the tone here. We're going to be talking about world discussion, things in the world, and the elections. And Vermin Supreme is someone who's been running that you may not have heard of, but he's rising in popularity as a sort of satire candidate almost for the people that we have to decide between in all these heckin' elections, where you generally have to pick the lesser of two evils. But without further ado, I will join the voice chat here with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello?
Yo.
Oh, hey.
Hey.
How was I'm not sure what you were doing last week, but how did it go?
It went well. I went to the Oregon coast with my family. And then when I got back, my girlfriend visited for a couple days. So that was cool.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And we just got started with world discussion with the cheeky Vermin Supreme video.
Yeah, I heard that.
Yeah.
Sounds like a colorful figure.
Yeah. I think he's the kind of person we need running in politics, just to make us laugh sometimes, so we don't get too sad. I don't think he has a legit chance of winning, but
No,
it's good commentary.
What office was he running for exactly?
The President of the United States of America.
Oh,
Yeah.
ambitious.
I don't think he expected to win, but it was
No.
definitely funny. Did you have any info on the elections? Anything that jumped out at you as particularly interesting?
Particularly interesting. I don't know. How much have you read about them?
Not much at all.
Not much at all. Okay. Well, let's see. The Senate was called the other day. Did you see that?
The Senate was called for the what?
The Democrats have retained control of the Senate.
Oh, okay.
So that's a done deal, which was I mean, it was always a toss-up, but it's still a little surprising. In general, the expectation is that the Republican Party would be able to pick up at least the House and pretty good chance of the Senate. But as it happens, the Republican Party somewhat underperformed, at least relative to expectations predicated on historical precedent. So I think it was yesterday that the election in Nevada was called for the Democratic candidate. And so with that win, as well as the win in Pennsylvania and the other one, there's like four key Senate races people were following: Nevada, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and then another one I keep forgetting. But basically, the Democrats won three of those, and having won the three, it doesn't really matter if they lose the fourth one. They're going to retain control of the Senate regardless. There's going to be a runoff election in Georgia, which is the one undecided Senate race right now. And if they manage to win that, they'll actually gain a seat in the Senate, which again, very much not expected. It was thought they'd lose more, or well, would lose some, at least. But it hasn't happened, at least not yet. House of Representatives is still up in the air. Most likely the Republican Party will win control, but it's much closer than was expected. And there is an outside chance the Democrats could actually retain control. Again, that's pretty unlikely. The Democrats would have to win the vast majority of the remaining undecided races, most of which are toss-ups. So statistically speaking, you would think that the Republicans would have it, just based on the odds. But who's to say? Anything could happen. We've already been pretty thoroughly surprised thus far, given the results. So something to watch, basically. But yeah, in general, the Republican Party kind of has struggled with what probably should have been an easy layup. They probably should have been able to make pretty sweeping gains here. Normally, incumbents and incumbent parties struggle in the midterm election after a presidential election. And certainly the Biden administration has suffered quite a few setbacks of one variety or another that made them vulnerable. So the fact that the Republican Party was not able to capitalize on that, from what I've read, has been attributed partly to quote-unquote candidate quality. That had to do with the fact that a lot of right-leaning candidates that were pretty hardcore Trump supporters were able to win out in a lot of primaries, pushing out more moderate candidates. And it seems that accusations that this would be a severe disadvantage, especially in swing districts that were competitive in the midterm election, were pretty dead on. It's looking like those candidates have lost pretty badly overall. In the cases where they've been competitive, it's been much closer than was expected. So some examples of that I had written down. There was a Trump supporter candidate in, New Hampshire, Don Bolduc. And he lost to the incumbent Democrat, Maggie Hassan, by a pretty large margin. And also worth noting here, the gubernatorial candidate, Chris Sununu, who once referred to Trump as quote-unquote fucking crazy, was able to cruise pretty easily to re-election. Over in Ohio, the Trump-supported candidate and Trump-backing candidate, J.D. Vance, was able to win, but again, the margin of victory was much slimmer than had been predicted. And then in Arizona, the gubernatorial election there, which has been closely watched because the Republican candidate, Kari Lake, is very much a, prototypical Trump-supporting candidate, very much in the same mold of Trump himself, has not done nearly as well as was expected. She was expected to win relatively handily, but as was, the election is still, as of this moment, too close to call. So overall, it's looking like brand Trump, so to speak, has been damaged. And there's already been a lot of Trump critics in the Republican Party who have taken the opportunity to come out and start slinging accusations And there is some evidence that amongst the rank and file of the Republican Party, that people are kind of getting a little tired of the act by now and are looking for somebody else to be the standard bearer for their movement. That's not to say that some of the ideas that Trump introduced to the Republican Party that had previously been sort of maybe not unacceptable, but had been outside the norm, those are probably here to stay. But Trump is not necessarily going to be the guy for them to propagate those ideas going forward. It remains to be seen just how permanent the damage is. I mean, hypothetically, he could come back. Anything's possible. But at this point, this is one of the first major defeats for Trumpism. 2020 kind of saw the first set of defeats for him. Obviously he lost the election and whatnot. But he had plenty of support still within the party after that. He claimed that the election was rigged, and the Democrats, still provided examples of, well, I mean, maybe not necessarily the party itself, but the Democrat brand was still damaged from 2020, after 2020, because of accusations of radicalism, earned or otherwise, that were able to kind of undermine the party's support in 2020 in particular. So he still had some momentum, even though he lost. But at this point, that momentum seems to have been halted. And whether or not Trump is able to continue his ascent in the party, or whether this sort of marks the beginning of the end for him in the party and his influence in the party, those are very much open questions right now. So it could be the Republican Party is on track to kind of stabilize and move back towards the center, where it had been sort of before the populist moment struck, starting around 2016. That's very much what I think people are watching for right now. Mm-hmm. So that's probably the biggest takeaway from the midterm election as of now. Just that damage to the brand and of Trump, and the possibility that more moderate voices could begin to take the party, not necessarily in a different direction. It's probably going to continue on the track to be sort of more nationalist and relatively more nativist, but it'll do so under somewhat more measured leadership, I suspect, if the party does in fact move away from Trump, which again is an open question. Mm-hmm. Other than that, in general, again, centrist candidates kind of did very well, sort of regardless of party. So that again suggests that there's something of a moderating trend in American politics, which would be a nice change of pace. Also, Ron DeSantis looked pretty strong in his election win in Florida. He was running again for the governorship, and he was able to win just handily. In fact, it was kind of a minor disaster for the Democrats in Florida. They pretty well got wiped out at the state level. So that suggests that his brand, contrary to Trump, is very much in the ascendant. And so that makes it relatively more likely that he's going to challenge Trump for the Republican nomination to the presidency in the 2024 election, mm-hmm. and in the lead up therein. So that suggests also that somewhat more moderate voices are in the ascendant, and that even if Trump does try to rally here in the aftermath of this, he's going to face pretty stiff competition. Because again, DeSantis has pretty strong support, and he's managed to be much more acute in listening to shifting public opinion and in moderating his message in a way that optimizes his support. So DeSantis 2024 looking a lot more likely, Trump 2024 looking a lot less likely, and in general, speaking broadly.
Yeah, for the Republican primary.
Yeah. As far as election integrity, that was something else people were kind of watching for. People were kind of curious whether or not there would be a deluge of accusations of election fraud and more threats to election, to the people kind of running the nuts and bolts of the election. That's what happened in 2020. So there was a lot of concern that it might happen again in 2022 and establish a trend. But as it happens, that did not happen. So that doesn't mean it won't happen in future, but at this point you can't say there's a trend. It seems like it was more of a blip at this point in 2020. If it doesn't happen in 2024, which is a more direct comparison to 2020, since 2024 will also be a presidential election. That'll do a lot in itself to kind of disprove this notion that we're kind of trending towards populist authoritarianism. That would suggest that confidence in elections is kind of being restored and that there is, again, a trend towards normalcy and restoring something resembling equilibrium in American politics.
Yes.
So there hasn't been, sorry?
Seeing a swing towards the centrist is good. We've talked about being like polarized more and more so based on like what sells and what gets clicks in media and things like that. So for people with less crazy ideas and things that are more relatable and also apply to more people is going to be something that I think a lot of people have been wanting for a while, but the fire of the populist movement definitely won a lot of hearts and minds too. So it's kind of figuring out what is our like average political orientation spread going to swing back to.
Yeah, we definitely seem to be on the backswing of the pendulum in that sense. Or at least this election would suggest as much. You know, again, anything can happen, so who's to say? But the evidence suggests that at this point, populism is more on the wane, not only on the right, but also on the left. But yeah, as far as election integrity, there hasn't been a lot of posts, viral posts or accusations or whatnot about election rigging. And there hasn't been any violence to speak of. So pretty good night overall for the health of American democracy as an institution, which is also good news. Abortion as an issue largely saw a pretty decently consistent slew of victories for the pro-choice movement. There was a number of constitutional amendments up for a vote, as well as legislation and whatnot, basically that would either extend protections to reproductive rights or strip them. And overall, very much it was the pro-choice side of those votes that largely won out. So that suggests that while there is still support for abortion restrictions, that support is heavily qualified, it would seem. That seems to be the takeaway. So yes on abortion restrictions, but no on radical abortion restrictions. So that battle remains to kind of be fought. It's not a settled matter, but it seems the equilibrium is some extent of abortion restrictions, more so than what existed before, but not necessarily like full Gilead, like some of the people had been worried about. Let's see, as far as perceptions and trends, just some things I noted in some of the articles I read. In preliminary exit polls, there was about equal proportions of voters who were saying that Democrats and Republicans were quote unquote too extreme, which is interesting because, going by the internet, you would think it was just the Republicans who were too extreme. And, there's a debate to be had about whether or not that's true. I'm not going to come down on one side or the other of that. I'm not your mother. I'm not going to tell you guys listening what to believe. But regardless of what you believe on that, the polling here suggests that the American public, writ large, seems to see equal degrees of radicalism by both parties. And I thought that was a very interesting finding and a notable one. And it suggests that those kind of trying to hew towards the middle kind of have the right idea here. It's not just the Republicans people are concerned about. There seems to be an equal part of concern in the body politic about Democrats. If you don't agree with that, then maybe that suggests there's a messaging problem, or at least that maybe the Republicans are much better at messaging. But regardless, it's going to be something that the Democratic Party, if not also the Republican Party, needs to address if they expect to continue to gain votes and support in future elections. Also, Ohio and Florida had been seen more as sort of swing states, but after this election, as well as results from recent elections, it really seems like they're more and more solidly Republican. So I don't know if in future elections, Ohio and Florida are really going to be seen as these critical battleground states. They seem to be pretty reliably Republican at this point. You can probably thank Trump for that. The whole Trumpian movement definitely shifted Republican Party platforms in a way that was somewhat more nationalistic and protectionist which I think are policies that were more popular amongst older voters in Florida and industrial voters in Ohio. So that's probably going to stay part of the Republican platform going forward, and in so much as that's the case, the GOP can probably count on Ohio and Florida. So that's an important change right there, if that does hold. I also thought it was worth noting that there was a continued shift among minorities towards the right. It wasn't as pronounced in this midterm election, but it was noted in at least one article that Hispanics voted in greater numbers for the Republican Party. It wasn't as much of an increase as was noted in 2020, which I think was double digits, but it seems to be a trend at this point. There was a more pronounced shift among Asian Americans. The shift there towards the Republican Party was more noted than among other groups. So that seems to be another trend worth noting here. So overall, it seems that minority groups that had traditionally been reliably Democratic in their voting have started to kind of diversify in that regard. The reasons why are debatable. Some of it has to do with crime. I did read that Asian Americans in New York City broke more for the Republican Party in these elections because of crime as an issue. So that could be something that you could attribute there. But it probably is something that varies considerably depending on constituency and also depending on the individual Asian group. Asian Americans are a very diverse group. It's a group that includes people from China, India, or the Middle East. Asia's pretty big. All of those people have different profiles. But in general, they seem to be shifting, as a group anyway, more towards the right. So we'll see if that continues on. But for now, it's something to keep in mind for the future.
So if minority groups shifted toward the right, but the right lost ground with the Democrats holding the Senate, who shifted left then?
It's not really people who shifted left. It's more about people in swing districts being relatively more moderate and voting more moderate. So in the big states, Nevada, the big Senate races, that is Nevada, Pennsylvania, Georgia, etc. Generally, you had sort of Trumpian-style Republican candidates up against more moderate Democratic candidates. And in general, moderate voters who kind of are more independent in outlook and don't necessarily consistently vote for one party or the other, this time those people broke for the Democrats because they seem to have the more moderate candidates, which would seem to back the reasoning put out by the Democratic Party strategists that it would be better to eschew calls from the left wing of the party to try to embrace more radical positions in order to boost turnout, and instead go for more of a moderate outlook and a set of campaign platforms in order to try to pull people from the center away from the right. And that seems to have won the night. I mean, again, Democrats definitely outshone expectations. So it seems to be a winning strategy at this point. But it's not necessarily the case that the right lost voters. It was more of a battle for people in the center. And I would point out this was a battle specifically happening in districts that were already pretty evenly balanced. It's not as though people who voted consistently Republican in Republican areas shifted away from the party. That didn't happen. By and large, both parties were able to retain control over their respective strongholds. This was very much an election, set of elections, midterm elections, that was won in battleground constituencies, battleground districts that were pretty evenly balanced and were very much probably the Republicans for the taking. But again, they eschewed the normal strategy for those kinds of districts. And as a result, it seems they've been punished pretty heavily. I'm sure there's not a few people in the Republican Party who are not entirely unhappy about that. They probably don't like losing, but at the same time, this gives them a lot more ammunition with which to challenge the Trumpian wing of the party and to try to bring them more to heel.
Mm-hmm. Getting back more of that establishment Republican energy, appealing to more moderates and stuff.
Yeah, they're probably feeling the wind at their backs at this point.
Mm-hmm. The chat is saying that there was a greater number of young voters than ever before. Still probably relatively low compared to older people. I saw a graph recently that was like people who are 65 plus have like about a 50% voting rate, and people who are in the youngest age bracket of like 18 to 30 or something, their voter turnout rate is like 10% or less. It's very low.
Yeah. Yeah, the youth don't normally come out much unless it's some kind of big election with some kind of big ticket item part of it. But yeah, you're right, or Chad is right anyway. Yeah, the youth turnout was surprisingly high, and that would have bolstered Democratic performance. Another factor helping them out was abortion. There was a lot of debate about whether or not the abortion ruling would kind of cause increased turnout amongst Democratic voters, which might otherwise have been relatively low during a midterm election. But it seems that it actually did boost turnout. That's part of why a lot of those that's part of why the pro-choice side of a lot of those referenda and constitutional amendments was able to win out. There was probably a lot of Dem voters, and probably a lot of them women too, who came out who might not have otherwise come out, and were able to kind of go against the trend as far as the incumbent party losing out in a midterm election. So there's a lot of credit to be attributed there as well as far as the outcome. So youth voters and what you might call single issue voters as far as the abortion issue, those people seems to have been some of the major contributors here to the surprise outcome.
Someone in the chat is asking about gerrymandered districts giving Republican voters a sign of continued efforts on Republican policymakers.
Wait, what? A sign?
Yeah, was the gerrymandering a sign of efforts by Republican policymakers? I don't quite understand the question.
I think he's asking if gerrymandering, well, I think he's asking if Republican victories in the race are a manifestation of gerrymandering, or maybe to what degree are GOP victories in the midterm elections attributable to gerrymandering. I mean, there's been some of that. If the Republican Party wins control of the House as expected, it's excuse me, it's probably going to be a pretty narrow margin that they control the House by. And the more narrow the margin, then the more you can attribute that margin to gerrymandering. Because I have read that they are going to pick up at least some seats due to gerrymandering at the state level. If their margin of victory was large, then they would not be able to attribute their control of the House to gerrymandering. They would be able to attribute it to a mandate from the public. But, if the number of seats that you can attribute to gerrymandering that they win is larger than the margin by which they control the House, then yeah, you could say they won because of gerrymandering. And that's actually going to be a pretty big deal going forward if that is the case. I haven't seen the final numbers. We haven't seen yet how the House is going to look as far as who controls how many seats. But yeah, that's something to watch. I'm sure that if you can attribute the victory in the House to gerrymandering, then the Democrats are going to home in on that. And that's also going to be a real rallying cry for activists who have already been homing in on things like voter suppression and gerrymandering by the Republican Party, especially in right-leaning states like Texas, the one I live in. They'll probably use that to good effect, I suspect, because that is pretty dubious to have a major branch of government there be decided by that kind of tactics. It's happened before. It's not like it's unprecedented, but given the polarization in American politics and the degree to which one party or the other has engaged in dirty tricks, that will be something people home in on. So I expect that to be a major point of contention in the 2024 election and the lead up therein, if it does come to that.
Yeah, some people are asking what gerrymandering is. It's a way of redrawing the districts, which is going to give a certain entity more favor than they would have otherwise by, say, narrowly winning both groups, as opposed by pretty much concentrating your opposition in a controlled area where that they can win that zone, but they're not going to win the area overall. I think it's legal. It's just one of those things that's considered gross.
Yeah, it's opportunism. I would point out, too, that gerrymandering is something done at the state level because according to the U.S. Constitution, power is reserved for the states to decide how they allocate their seats in the House of Representatives. And in the United States, we have a first-past-the-post system in which those seats, by and large, again, it depends on the states, but pretty much every state allocates those seats based on who wins given districts. And so that creates an incentive to design the districts in a way that ensures your preferred party is winning relatively more seats. Again, there's a lot of variance from state to state on how that's done. Some states are actually better about doing it in an objective, bipartisan way. But other states are very much not good at that. A lot of states have histories of one-party control, effectively, where just one party dominated the state politics, and obviously the party leadership in those states has very rarely been interested in reforming political systems in those states such that gerrymandering was dealt with, directly. Generally, they benefit from it, and so they just kind of ignore it casually. Texas historically has been a one-party state. For a long time, only Democrats won. And then more recently, in past decades, it shifted towards the Republican Party. We do have a pretty sizable Democratic Party here. We have a lot of urban voters in particular who tend to vote Democrat. And so there are a lot of Democratic representatives in the Texas legislature. But by and large, it's still heavily Republican dominated to the point where they control most of the major institutions in the state, political institutions anyway. So gerrymandering here is still an issue. And again, that's no surprise. That's basically tradition. But if the Republican Party does win a majority predicated on gerrymandering efforts, I don't doubt that there's going to be a lot of activism in places like Texas to try to address that. I don't know how much traction they'll have. Again, Texas is still very reliably conservative. I would point out that one of the outcomes from the midterm elections is that I don't want to say left wing per se, but the Democrat darling who was running for the governorship, Beto O'Rourke, was handily trounced by the incumbent Republican candidate, Abbott, who was able to, again, pretty easily win that election. And there had been hope amongst Democrats that the margin of victory at least would be relatively close, suggesting that the gap between Democratic support and Republican support in the state was at least closing over time. But given how handily Abbott won, that seems not to be the case. So Texas most likely is going to stay pretty reliably Republican for a while. And I suspect we'll probably have more evidence to believe that in 2024. Although, again, that's speculation. Anything can happen.
Why do you think he won so handily? I've gotten tons of text messages because I still have a Texas phone number. So they're like, are you voting for Governor Abbott and the thing? Can we count on you for Beto O'Rourke?
Well, part of it was the shift towards the right by Hispanic voters. Texas is a minority majority state. Whites are still the largest racial group. Well, I should say non-Hispanic whites, technically, are still the largest group, but they're not a majority of the population, meaning that they're less than 50%. And probably pretty soon, Texas will be majority Hispanic, if it isn't already. It's very close. But the fact that Hispanic voters are shifting towards the right is going to hobble efforts by the Democratic Party to try to make Texas purple, so to speak, to make it a swing state of some kind that's actually competitive. That's not going to be the case if Hispanic voters continue to shift towards the right. The Republicans already have a pretty solid hold on the white vote in the state. Minorities had traditionally been an important bulwark for the Democratic Party, but it seems that that support is starting to erode. I would point out that even in Uvalde, as far as voting for their state representative in the legislature, they did actually vote for the Republican candidate. So support is pretty robust, and it seems to be getting stronger amongst some groups that had been expected to break differently. So that's part of the reason that he lost. Another reason is that he's a Democrat. he's a prototypical Democrat, and in some ways he's a stereotypical Democrat. I mean, he literally said once, public in front of cameras, that he wanted to take our guns, and that's just dumb. That's not the move.
Beto O'Rourke said that?
Oh yeah,
in Texas.
In Texas.
Oh my gosh.
That's not the move, man. Like, if you wanna be pro gun regulation in Texas, you can, but there's ways to do it and ways not to do it, and that was the way not to do it. So that only hurt him. That made it very easy to paint him as a radical lib lefty who just wants to grab your guns. Gun grabber is a real insult in Texas, and he just made that an easy layup for the GOP. So stuff like that just hurt him. He's always been the kind of Democratic candidate that wants to rally people by being boisterous and having a strong personality in public. But Texas just really isn't ready for that. He was able to get surprising amounts of support. I think it was in 2016, 2018, whenever it was, that he was running for the Senate against Ted Cruz. I think it was 2018. But that was a surprisingly strong turnout, probably largely predicated on the fact that was the first election after Trump won in 2016. Mm-hmm. After that, support has waned a little bit. So I don't think Texas is gonna, I don't think O'Rourke was ever a realistic candidate, and I don't think Texas is going to turn purple anytime soon, if it ever does.
Yeah, I think Texas could vote left on certain issues, but gun is not the one.
No. No. I agree. Well, as far as implications, I've already talked about some of the overarching political and strategic implications, but more specifically in terms of actual political fallout here at the national level, if the Republican Party does end up taking control of the House, again, that's very likely. They're probably, that is to say, House Republicans are probably going to start up a bunch of investigations of Joe Biden, and more specifically Joe Biden's family. Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, has done him no favors with his behavior over the past couple years. You might think he might try to moderate things a bit once his father was in the White House, but nope. Just crack cocaine and hookers. And videos to prove it. So the Republican Party in the House is going to have a field day with him. I have no doubt they'll find something on him, some kind of dirt. Obviously, there's a lot of dirt already existing, but I'm sure they'll find more. So that'll probably be used as ammunition by the Republican Party in 2024, no doubt.
And they're making that movie about him too, right?
Oh, are they?
Yes.
I hadn't heard about that.
Yes, there's a Hunter Biden movie. I don't know if it's like a propaganda piece per se. Probably is, because I think it puts him in a really bad light. But yeah, that's got to be annoying if you're trying to do high level political shit and you've just got a child that is running amok.
Yeah, I'm not sure how that's going to pan out, but I'm sure that the House GOP will make as much of a circus of it as they can. Mm-hmm. But I don't expect too much substantive to come out of that. That's mostly going to be a political move, I expect. I don't think the investigations will likely actually go anywhere. They are also going to investigate the response to COVID-19. That could be interesting, but that's probably also largely going to be political theater. And also, they're going to investigate the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, that in particular should be interesting. The war in Afghanistan was, well, it was botched, from one end to the other, to be blunt about it. So the U.S. withdrawal was no exception. So I'm sure they'll find some interesting tidbits there that could make for some interesting addendums to the history of the U.S. war in Afghanistan. So that might be worth watching in particular. There's also some pressure amongst some in the Republican Party to impeach Joe Biden, but I don't think they're going to have enough votes for that. Certainly not the Senate, given that they were not able to take control of it, but probably also they won't have enough votes in the House. But there may be some attempt, at least. You may hear about it in the news that the House GOP is going to vote to impeach him, and then they'll try and then it'll fail. But they may just do it anyway, just for the theater of it. Mm-hmm. Let's see. Oh, Democratic control of the Senate means that there won't be any Senate investigations of Biden in the House vein. But also it means that Joe Biden will not face intransigent resistance to nominations to positions in his administration, things like diplomats and whatnot, as well as other positions. Also, if there's a spot that opens up in the Supreme Court, he'll probably be able to get his preferred candidate. Whereas if he had lost control of the Senate, almost certainly not. So that'll definitely be very helpful for the Biden administration, as well as for the Democratic Party generally. Let's see. Oh, also worth mentioning here, Donald Trump endorsed, from what I read, 4 Republicans for different secretaries of state positions in the general election in different states, and all of them ended up losing. These were generally swing states, so if Trumpian-style candidates had been able to win those positions, that would have meant that Trump supporters would have been in control of overseeing, would have been responsible for overseeing the administration of elections in 2024 in those states. And again, these were all critical swing states, places like Wisconsin and whatnot, that are going to be centers of attention in 2024. So if they had won, there would have been questions about election integrity, from the left as well as the right, probably. And there would have been a lot of focus on whether or not those candidates would have abused their power in those positions to try to swing the election towards their preferred candidate. But it's a non-issue, as was moderate candidates ended up winning those positions. There were some Trump-style candidates that did win election in local elections and state elections and whatnot, but by and large, they did not win in swing districts, certainly not in swing states. And so the result is that even if they do, want to be corrupt and abuse their power, largely they're in states that are going to vote for the Republican Party no matter what in 2024 anyway. So the scope with which they have to abuse their power is going to be pretty limited as a result, or at least there's the scope with which they have to swing an election is going to be relatively limited, shall we say, as a result. So overall, liberal democracy had a good night. I think that's the main takeaway. Radicals were punished, moderates were rewarded, and in general, we've broken the trend in American politics that we've seen since 2016 of increasingly radicalized candidates gaining traction. Whether or not we can make that itself a trend, that remains to be seen. But we've at least got the first step taken in that regard. I would point out, too, that this is actually a pretty good election for American foreign policy. One of the things that foreign observers in other countries have been trying to gauge since 2020 is the likelihood of a return to power of a Trump-style populist in the United States. If that particular faction of American politics was still looking strong, that would suggest that American credibility was undermined. Basically, there are, the current sitting government wants relations with the rest of the world, wants to reinforce and reestablish international institutions that it feels were undermined by the Trump administration. There's a lot of countries that are receptive to that message, but they don't really want to do it if they're going to just end up having to deal with another Trump or a Trump-style president in the near future. So the fact that Trumpian populism kind of suffered a defeat in the midterm elections, that actually builds up the credibility of those voices in American politics that are seeking more connectivity to other states and nations in American foreign policy. And correspondingly, that should help the U.S. government, not only this one, but future governments, make promises that other states actually have faith in.
Maybe turning back that institutional decline a little bit. That sounds good.
Yeah, that's a positive signal. Here's hoping. But I still want to see electoral reform before I really put a bow on that. That's still a battle to be fought. I'm hoping that Congress will be able to address that before 2024, hopefully in the upcoming term. We'll see, something to watch. But overall, a surfeit of good news for once in the United States. Oh, it's also worth mentioning that Donald Trump says he has a very important announcement that he's going to make on November the 15th. And the expectation is that he's going to announce his presidential run for 2024. So that's just 2 days from now, so keep an eye out for that. I'm sure there will be lots of reporting on it if and when it happens.
It's the announcement of an announcement.
Yeah.
Anyone who's a fan of Blizzard games knows how amazing that is. I have an announcement to make, and that is, I'm going to make an announcement. Oh, wow. Amazing.
It's worth mentioning, too, that Donald Trump has started to focus more of his ire on Ron DeSantis. He sees him as the natural and most likely rival for the Republican nomination for the presidency in 2024. So he's been much more vocal in his public statements about how he's a bad candidate, how he's weak, how he only won because of Trump's support, and he gave him a nickname. I read in an article that Trump only gives nicknames to people he feels threatened by. So he started calling him Ron DeSanctimonious, which is clever. It's the typical Trumpian style nickname. I can get it. I can see it working. But that just indicates the degree of infighting that we're likely to see if Trump really does run for president again. There's probably going to be some pretty heated tension between Trump and DeSantis.
Yeah, Trump's won the primary both times he's gone for the Republican primary vote. So we don't really have precedent for, okay, what happens if he bashes all of his Republican opponents, but then narrowly loses it? It's like, are his fans going to vote for the other Republican candidate or not?
Yeah. Yeah, that's an open question. He could even run as a third-party candidate if he wants to pull a Ross Perot. I'm sure the Democratic Party would love that. You know, for those of you who maybe don't remember Ross Perot, he was a very wealthy man. He was actually the guy that owned or maybe even founded Texas Instruments. He was a well-known figure down here in Texas. And he decided that he didn't like the candidates that either party was running or had been running. And so he decided to spend a bunch of his own money to run for president in I want to say the 92 election, if I'm not mistaken. And he was taken seriously enough to actually be allowed to participate in the debates, which I think he himself pointed out was only possible because he'd spent so much money. So it was one of those rare elections where a third-party candidate was actually seen as viable. As it happened, the impact of his presidential run was largely just to bleed votes from the Republican candidate, which at that time was George H.W. Bush. So the result was not so much a competitive election between three equal candidates. More so it was Ross Perot effectively handing the election to Bill Clinton, the Democratic candidate, which is how Bill Clinton ended up becoming president the first time. So Donald Trump could do something similar. He could try to run as a third-party candidate to win the presidency, but in effect split the Republican ticket and hand the election to the Democratic Party. You'd think he would be averse to that if he were a strategic thinker, but I don't think anybody thinks of the man as a strategic thinker. Given how large his ego, I could easily see him doing that.
Yeah. What was the election reform stuff you were mentioning before?
Yeah. So there was a lot of talk back in 2020 about potentially Donald Trump trying to abuse certain provisions within electoral laws at the federal level to try to swing the election towards him, despite the fact that he'd lost. So that largely came down to Trump trying to pressure state governments, and specifically secretaries of state responsible for overseeing state elections, to try to get them to refuse to certify election results. And that had to do with an old electoral law that had been passed at the federal level way back in the 1870s, which had been originally written and passed to try to prevent electoral gridlock stemming from a potential disagreement over certification of votes. You know, basically there was an election back in the 1870s, And a lot of state governments disputed the results of their own elections to the point where they were failing to deliver the results of their elections to the government through the normal channel. And the result was a bunch of negotiations and disputes at the federal level over how to resolve the election. For those curious, this is actually the election that ended up getting won by Rutherby Hayes, if I'm not mistaken. It was the first election after the second term of the Ulysses S. Grant administration. Grant had been for those of you who are Americans, this is probably all old news, but maybe for those of you from other countries, you may find this interesting. Ulysses S. Grant was a famous general in the American Civil War. And after the war, he ran as a Republican candidate for president and easily won. He was obviously extremely popular. He was seen as the guy that had effectively won the war for the Union. And his his term in office was just plagued with corruption. Like he was a very good general in a lot of ways, but he was a terrible president. Like he just had no idea how the institutions of government worked, and as a result, he was overly reliant on advisors. And in that particular period of American history, American politics was very, very corrupt. And so most of his advisors just took the opportunity to take advantage of his ignorance and exploit him for their own personal benefit. So after 2 terms in office, Ulysses S. Grant left. And one of the main issues in that first election had to do with Reconstruction of the South, because after the American Civil War, the South was still being occupied, in large part, not everywhere, but in large part, southern states were still being occupied by federal soldiers, federal military units. And they still did not have full sovereignty. There were still limitations on what the state governments were allowed to do. So one of the things the Democratic Party did is they actually came out and ran on a campaign platform of white supremacy. The idea being that the Republican Party was the party of the Negro vote and that they were going out of their way to try to keep black people in power in the South. Because, of course, black people were given the vote, former slaves and whatnot, after the Civil War ended. But that ended up being very controversial, not only in the South, but actually also in the North. The desire to give the vote to former slaves was not really predicated on any notion of racial equality. Even among people who supported the North and wanted to give them the vote, even they were very racist. Like racism was just sort of the norm at the time. The idea of extending the vote had to do more with the idea of kind of Republican nationalism. Not Republican in a party sense, but just the idea that the United States was a citizen republic and that citizenship should be extended to all of its citizens. Even if they didn't think that they were racially equal, as terrible as that sounds, that's just kind of how they thought at the time. It didn't hurt that the Republican Party also thought that they could make black voters in the South permanent Republican voters, basically. The Republican Party basically painted itself as the party of liberation, and they were hoping that they could use support amongst the African-American population to maintain their hold not only on state offices in the South, but also effectively permanently control Congress. So there was more than a little bit of self-interest at play going on there as well. Regardless, all of that was sort of going on in the background of that election in I think it was 1871 or 72. And as it happened, the election ended up being extraordinarily close, and that resulted in a lot of corrupt, political actors trying to obfuscate the result. And that's what led to all of the confusion about the certification of the state vote for the presidency. And the result is that there was a kind of handshake agreement between the leaderships of the Republican Democratic parties. The Democratic Party agreed to effectively take steps that would allow the Republican Party to win the presidency and make I can never say his name.
Rutherford B. Hayes.
Thank you. That guy. To make that guy the new president. But in exchange, the Democratic Party demanded and got a formal end to Reconstruction in the South. So the restrictions on southern states and what remained of federal troops in states, all of that was withdrawn. And effectively that marked the beginning of Jim Crow in the South. The actual Jim Crow laws would come later, but at that point, the previous political elites in the South who had led the South before the Civil War started making a comeback. And certainly white nationalists of one sort or another also really began to establish white supremacy as a core part of the identity there and a core part of the politics. with results that will not surprise anybody. I think everybody's familiar with the course of segregation in the United States, which really became institutionalized and legalized after that election. So a pretty important election, but all of that is just a tangent. I thought it was interesting trivia. But again, to bring this full circle, because of the confusion over the certification of the vote, Congress went out of their way after the fact to pass a new law in order to try to clarify that. And that's the law we actually still have today. Now, what happens is that, according to this law, if there are multiple states that are failing to certify their vote, then what happens is that the electoral votes for those states, which again are the votes that are actually used to determine who wins the presidency, those votes are not allocated according to the electoral representative, who is normally, according to state constitutions, determined by the outcome of the actual vote. Instead, those electoral votes will be attributed, or rather allocated, by the state legislature. And state legislatures may be controlled by a party that is different than the party that won the election. So that opens the door for a state legislature to actually change how those electoral votes would have been allocated. So it could be that the people voted for the Democratic candidate, but because of some snafu with the certification of the vote, or because of a dispute over the certification, according to this law I'm talking about, a potentially Republican-controlled state legislature could choose to vote to allocate those electoral votes towards the Republican candidate. So that's the scenario that people were concerned about in the lead up to the 2020 election, and that's probably what Trump and some of his more opportunistic lawyers Rudy Giuliani among them, were probably trying to do when they were pressuring people like Secretary of State Raffensperger in the state of Georgia. You know, the phone call that was made between Trump and Raffensperger is pretty famous at this point. Trump was basically asking him, if not begging him, to quote unquote find votes in order to swing the outcome of the election towards Trump. So that's a problem. You know, ideally, it would not be. Ideally, you would have people in power running for office who were not so crassly opportunistic as to try to take advantage of what is an open loophole in the electoral law. And for most of American history, since that law was passed, which again was more than 100 years ago, it really hasn't been much of a problem. But in 2020, it was. And it could be that opportunistic people of that vein could return to power or try to return to power. And if they do, I think it would be a good idea if, well, given that it's a possibility, I think it would be a good idea if that loophole were somehow closed. And so that's what I mean when I talk about electoral reform in the United States. And this is not something that's just me being a nerd or paranoid. This is something that people in the government, in both parties even, have actually talked about doing. It was hoped that it would happen before the midterm elections, sometime in 2021 or 2022, but as it happened, that ended up getting pushed to the back burner, and more focus was put on things like the infrastructure bill, the environmental bill. It was called a climate bill, but effectively it was more of an industrial policy bill. But basically there was a lot of other stuff the government prioritized. And because negotiations over those bills took up so much bandwidth at the legislative and executive level, there just wasn't enough time to do anything else. So hopefully now there can be more focus on electoral reform. I would really prefer that American institutions address their flaws when they arise. You know, preferably it would have never been a flaw to begin with, but you know, we live in an imperfect world. So ideally that loophole can be closed, and maybe American institutions made that much more robust as a consequence.
I see. So you think we should reform our elections by closing an ancient loophole from over 100 years ago? Yeah, and
I think it's
the kind of one too where if there's an established norm, then no one's going to try to abuse the loophole, and then someone says, you know what if we just didn't respect this norm and we just tried to win in any way possible?
Yeah, that's the concern. And you know, people can still do that even if you close that loophole. And people can still undermine other norms. And, you know, really, there's nothing stopping people from just being fully self-interested and undermining American democracy generally to the point where it's rendered dysfunctional. Like, there's no amount of reforms that could stop that. The only thing we can do is try to encourage moderate candidates who respect established democratic norms, as well as push to establish new democratic norms, as dreamy as that sounds, in order to try to protect the integrity of democratic institutions in the United States. That's the only real safeguard. You know, it really just comes down to people choosing to exhibit forbearance in the face of temptation. And that's just very difficult to reform away. You know, you can pass all the protections and rules you want, but if people really want to break something, they're going to do it. And there's not going to be much you can do about it. But that said, that doesn't mean it's not worth trying to address those loopholes and flaws where you find them, and to just make it a little more difficult for the rabble rousers and opportunists to do their damage. That's about all I had in my notes about it. Was there anything else you kind of wanted to get to or maybe comment on?
So Israeli election, I think, was also called.
Oh yeah, Netanyahu won. That's going to be interesting. Yeah, what did I have? There was a specific party. Yeah, the Religious Zionism Party. It's an ultra-nationalist religious party. And it's run by a guy named Itamar Ben-Gvir. Well, I guess it has two leaders, according to my notes. Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. I'm almost certainly mispronouncing these names, so I have to apologize. But Ben-Gvir, at least, was a follower of the ultranationalist Meir Kahane, who headed an organization, a far-right organization, that was explicitly banned in Israel and actually designated as a terrorist group by the United States government. It was also noted in the article I read that this organization was explicitly racist, quote unquote. So this guy's follower is one of the leaders of one of the parties that is now core to the control of the government by Netanyahu. It's a part of his governing coalition. And that's going to create some interesting effects on Israeli diplomacy, because Arab states in the region that had been warming to Israel before the election had already said that if there was a far-right government in Israel, it was going to make cooperation very, very complicated for obvious reasons. Which is not to say that Arab governments in the region actually care about the Palestinian issue. They kind of don't. But they do have to at least pretend to. And it's kind of hard to pretend to when there's a far-right government in Israel going out of its way to expand settlements and possibly propagate acts of violence against Palestinians, not only in the occupied territories, but also in Israel itself. So that's going to be something to keep an eye on. You know, just to what extent does the far-right nature of the new government that's coming in, how does that manifest? To what degree does that define policymaking? It could be that they try to keep it on the down low. They may try to keep it low key out of an interest in trying to maintain some of the new flowering relationships Israel has cultivated among some of its traditional rivals in the region. But I'm a little skeptical. Far-right parties are not known for their forbearance. So we'll see. Maybe they'll surprise me, but I do not have high expectations at this point. I would point out that other than that particular aspect, I don't really expect a lot of change. It's not as though the government that Netanyahu is replacing, the opposition unity government, it's not as though they were really not far right either. They definitely have their own far right elements, and they were largely unable to generate enough support to really change the course of Israeli policy on things like the settlements and other issues of import to the region. So by and large, in terms of foreign policy and whatnot, the Netanyahu government coming in is probably going to be pretty consistent with what came before, because what came before was itself pretty consistent with Netanyahu, specifically the Netanyahu government they replaced. So the only question now is, how far right is this far right government going to be? That's the only open question. Other than that, it's probably going to mostly be status quo.
Who was the opposition who ran against him?
Everybody. Everybody except Netanyahu and maybe like two or three far-right settler parties. I think there were some right-wing, not far-right, but just right-wing parties that had been part of the coalition too. But I think they've lost some votes since then. Easily the largest member of Netanyahu's coalition is his own party, which I think is, oh hell, what was that? It slips my mind, but it easily is the largest partner, but it doesn't control enough seats to get a majority. And so the two far-right parties that he's shacked up with are basically the kingmakers at this point. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the opposition coalition that had been in control before the recent election, it was just everybody and their mother. It was like a gaggle of far-right parties that had leaders who had a lot of beef with Netanyahu on a personal level. There was what was left of the center-left in Israel, which really is not much. There was a Palestinian party that really hated Netanyahu, but also wasn't entirely comfortable being in a coalition with the two far-right parties. And also just a gaggle of just really small parties that kind of picked up one or two seats here and there. It was a lot of different actors, a lot of different parties, all crammed together into one unwieldy coalition. And again, the only thing they had in common is that they all hated Netanyahu. They had no real policy platform that united them. It was really just get rid of Netanyahu. That was it.
And they did not.
They did. Yeah. It was only for 2 years. Well, actually, probably not even 2. It was really just 1 year, I think, before they ended up losing their majority and having to call another election. But, for a brief moment, they did.
They got rid of him, and then he came back.
Yeah. Well, his party is still the largest. I'm going to look that up. That's going to drive me crazy. Netanyahu party. What is that? Netanyahu. Likud. That's what it was. His party is called Likud. Yeah, Likud still had a lot of support. I think it's easily the largest party of any party in Israeli politics right now. So if you're going to have any kind of opposition with a majority, invariably it means you're going to have to get a lot of different parties together to try to piece together a majority. And from what I read, Likud did a little better this time. So they're especially strong at this point. It's not really a party of ideas at this point, though, to be fair. It's really just the Netanyahu show. Netanyahu has basically turned the Likud party into his personal vehicle for political power. It used to be a party that had ideas about, the Palestinians, foreign policy, whatnot. It was kind of the more hawkish, conservative alternative, but eventually it just became his own little personal pet project. Mm. Yeah, we'll see what ramifications there are for the region as a whole. I have to think that Arab states in the region will prioritize Iran. That's still, I think, the main concern that they have. So they're probably going to be willing to overlook a lot of, shall we say, indiscretions by a far-right Israeli government. But I don't know how much they'll be able to get away with that without some kind of blowback as far as domestic political opposition to Israeli actions in the region. So probably status quo, and that's always the safest bet in foreign policy, but room for some drama. We shall see.
I did see there was I think, protester in Iran who was put into prison, and then when she got out, she took her life.
Yeah, that was on Reddit earlier.
Yeah, I think some of that has to do with just the prison conditions there as being, very, very bad.
Well, I mean, the Iranian government is not known for its humanitarianism. They've never felt particularly compelled to take it easy on protesters and whatnot. So yeah, political prisoners in particular have been targeted in the past, and most likely they've been ramping up the oppression since the protests started up. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a guy who commented in that same post on Reddit who posted a link to a report from a humanitarian NGO talking about some of the things that have happened in Iran's prisons in the past. And apparently there was a point in the 1980s when the government was trying, well, there were reformists in the government that were trying to get the government to release female dissidents that were being held in prisons. And so they actually were able to write up a paper, I guess not a ruling per se, but basically they made an argument to the clerisy, arguing that it was in keeping with Islamic law that female protesters be released. Basically they were trying to point to some provisions in the Quran that suggest that female apostates were not to be killed, but were rather supposed to be released after being punished. And the hardliners in the government, I mean, there were some people who were receptive to this idea, but hardliners in the government basically purposely misinterpreted the argumentation in a way such that they interpreted it to mean that women protesters could not be executed if they were virgins. And so the result was a outbreak of rape in the prisons. Basically, what the hardliners would do is that they would order the female prisoners to be raped so that it would be technically legal to execute them. It's not clear if they're still doing that. I haven't heard as much, but it at least happened in the 80s. And there's not a lot of oversight, over Iran's prisons, so it's quite possible that they still do that. I don't doubt that there's no small amount of abuse of prisoners of all kinds in an authoritarian political system of any sort, not least Iran's. So most likely there's more than a few people, especially women, that are coming under a lot of pressure right now, violent pressure from the Iranian government. And they've only been increasing the pressure since the protests have started. I did read rather, that there was some division within the Iranian government. The hardliners are pretty much the only faction in power right now. Everybody else has been pretty well marginalized, but there apparently are some people, specifically I think it was the Speaker of Parliament, who came out and said that all of the violence and oppression is not really worth just the hijab rules. He said that he was willing to give some concessions to try to appease the protesters, and he cited that as worthwhile, much more so than just continually committing acts of violence against protesters in the hopes that you can cow them into submission. I don't think his view is the majority of view. I haven't seen any other signs that the government is reversing course on this. And it may be that even if there is a lot of people in the government that want to change course, they may not be able to because of the hold that the Ayatollah has over the country. If the Ayatollah wants to crack down, then they may have no other choice but to do so. But there is at least some early signs of a schism there, and that could lay the groundwork for something later if things do continue to escalate. But for now, it's still early days. For now, it's just protesting and violence against protesters. We'll see where it goes from here.
Well, it makes it sound like the protesting hasn't really let up at all.
No, not really. It's still going on. It's not continuous. Basically, they mostly focus on certain days of the week, so it's calculated. And as it's gotten more dangerous, the protesters themselves have had to become more careful, which has also somewhat inhibited the frequency of protests. But overall, they do still continue, largely unabated. Did you see Brazil at all?
Did they just have an election and someone won?
Yeah, Bolsonaro lost. Lula da Silva won.
Oh, yeah, I think we covered that in the previous time.
Yeah, we talked about it last time. And what I said last time is that the thing I was watching for was whether or not Bolsonaro would try to make a move to stay in power, as well as what response his supporters would have. So he was pretty quiet for the days in the immediate aftermath of the election. But eventually he gave a kind of mealy-mouthed statement to the effect that he would not contest the election. He didn't concede, but he said that he would not contest it. So effectively, that was a de facto concession. And so it seems that he's not going to try to make some kind of power play here, which is good. Some of his supporters have not quite been so sanguine. There was a number of truckers, apparently, in particular, that started blocking roads and protesting to try to keep Bolsonaro in. But eventually those protests abated, and Bolsonaro himself eventually asked them to leave.
Yeah, he didn't lose. He just took his life in a different direction based on some evidence that he collected.
Yeah. So it seems that the integrity of Brazil's democratic institutions have been respected, which is a good thing, because there had been some question about that in the lead up to the election. So some good news for democracy in Brazil as well.
People actually doing elections properly. Good job, people.
It's a good trend. I encourage it.
Yeah, keep it up.
Let's see, what else did we have here? It's a pretty busy 2 weeks, really. We've got a pretty decent amount of stuff backed up. Well, did you see the big news out of Ukraine recently?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, Kherson was evacuated by the Russians.
Ooh.
Yeah. Not the whole province, mind you, but they evacuated all of the territory they were holding west of the Dnieper River. They had been under considerable pressure by the Ukrainian army. And from what I was reading, a lot of that came in the form of pressure on their logistics. You know, that's kind of the common theme here throughout the war. Apparently, the Ukrainians were making good use of the HIMARS rockets that the United States gave them, and were systematically targeting the bridge crossings over the Dnieper River, which were, of course, natural choke points for the supply chain, supplying Russian forces on the western side of the river. Apparently, they went out of their way to damage the bridges, not necessarily destroy them, but just damage them. And when Russian repair crews showed up to try to make them usable again, the repair crews were targeted by the Ukrainians. Again, using the rocket system, I assume. And the result was that the repair crews lost a lot of important equipment and whatnot that they needed to repair the bridges. So at that point, the Russians gave up trying to repair the bridges and started constructing pontoon bridges across the river, which were themselves then attacked and destroyed by the Ukrainians, again using ranged fires. So after that, the Russians finally just gave up and started using ferries to try to move equipment and personnel across the river. So they were still able to get supplies across, but ferries are an imperfect mechanism by which to do that. That pretty severely limited the amount of stuff that they were able to cross, with corresponding pressure on the supply of Russian units on the other side of the river. So the result over time is that between shortages of equipment and ammunition, food and whatnot, and intermittent attacks by Ukrainian units, the Russians seem to have determined that holding the west side of the river was no longer viable. And as a result, they announced that they were going to retreat. There was some question whether or not the announcement might be a trick to try to fool the Ukrainians into launching some kind of big attack and then maybe launching a surprise counteroffensive on them. But I think a day or two ago, that was proven not to be the case when the Russians actually did just fully withdraw to the other side of the river. And the result is that the city of Kherson, or maybe Kherson, the largest city that the Russians were able to take since the beginning of the war, is now back in Ukrainian hands, much to the delight of the citizens living there, as well as the nation as a whole. So that's a pretty big win for Ukraine there. No great battle for the city, as it happens, which I think everyone should be grateful for. But nonetheless, territory has been retaken, a pretty considerable amount at that. So as a result, Ukraine is now on the River Dnieper. Russia controls no territory on the western side of it, or the right bank, as it's called in Ukraine. Confusingly so for me.
Well,
So some good news out of Ukraine as well.
Yeah. This is weird getting good news. Is anyone else kind of tripped out in the chat? Like, what is this?
Like something's going to happen.
Yeah.
Right? This is building to something.
It'll swing back. It always swings back and forth. We'll savor it while we can.
Let's see, some notes here about the Russian retreat. The Russian retreat was actually announced live on television by a Russian general who had actually been promoted by President Putin and specifically tasked with making the announcement, which is really unusual. Usually they just kind of do what they want, right, as far as military operations, but the government was obviously sufficiently concerned with the optics of a withdrawal of this kind that it decided to make a formal announcement. It wasn't just about, having the general present the retreat as a strategic retreat and not a defeat per se. But it was also about the government trying to shift blame away from the government itself and more onto the military. So the retreat was a decision made by the military, not by the government. Seems to be the intention behind this sort of weird live presentation that was made. So some political consternation on the part of Moscow, it seems. There was also an attempt before the evacuation to try to evacuate civilians. The Russians were making noise about, quote unquote, offering to assist people wanting to evacuate the city in advance of the potential Ukrainian retaking of the city. Obviously, very few takers, to the point where they basically just had to cancel evacuations. There were some that took them up on it, but it's not clear how many, or maybe how many of those could have been even forced evacuations. But it seems that the overall number wasn't very big. So that was probably largely political theater, an effort at political theater on the part of the Russians there. As far as what's going to happen now, some people, well, I was reading the report on the Institute for the Study of War, which does, has regular releases about the course of the war in Ukraine, as well as other conflicts. And they're saying that the Russian forces that were withdrawn from the western side of the river are going to be redeployed probably to Donbass. There have been ongoing offensive Russian operations in Donbass for several months now, specifically around the Bakhmut area. Well, there's maybe a town called Bakhmut, and the Russians have been pushing pretty hard there for a while now. So it seems likely, from what I read, that the Russians will redeploy forces there and try to make ground. The Ukrainians, for their part, are probably going to establish strong defensive positions on the west side of the river and then redeploy units, possibly to Donbass to try to deflect pressure from Bakhmut, but also possibly to contribute more troops to ongoing offensive Ukrainian operations in the Kharkiv area, which is sort of in Lugansk. Maybe they'll surprise us, maybe they'll do something else, but that seems the likely course at this point. It's probably not going to be the case that the Ukrainians push across the river. The logistics of that would be very difficult. In the same way that Russian logistics were bottlenecked at the river and river crossings, any Ukrainian crossing would be similarly threatened. So more likely the Ukrainians will just try to hold the river and then focus offensive efforts elsewhere. I kind of wonder, and this is just me speculating, if Zaporizhia might not be the site of a future offensive. They wouldn't have to attack across a river or have their logistics bottlenecked on a river there. But they also wouldn't have to worry about running into large established Russian units, like those that exist in Donbass and Lugansk. So Zaporizhia could be an attractive point. Also, the Russian defensive line there is stretched relatively thin. They don't really have a lot of natural defensive barriers to work with in Zaporizhia. So I kind of wonder if that might also be a weak point. Again, that's just me spitballing, though. That's just kind of what I've been wondering and looking for in some of the stuff I've been reading, but I haven't really read anything of substance yet.
Sounded like things are relatively slow-moving overall. I'm kind of wondering if this winter is a point where Ukraine maybe is going to be stretched for their energy, like just to keep heating and
Not
stuff.
necessarily. I mean, economic activity has declined considerably in Ukraine, so that means that a lot of the industry that would normally be consuming natural gas will not be. So that means it's mostly just going to be consumers. And they'll probably get some natural gas from the West. I mean, they're still getting natural gas from Russia, technically. But beyond that, if they ration what they get, they should have enough to keep them warm in winter, I would expect. So that should not really be a problem, I would not think. Yeah, winter is not going to be too big a deal. I mean, the Ukrainians are pretty well supplied. I mean, they've got pretty wealthy backers, obviously. So they should be able to successfully winterize, shall we say, all of their personnel and equipment. There's actually bigger questions about whether the Russians will be able to make it through the winter. They're having some logistical issues obviously. So they may not actually have all of the winter equipment that they'll need to make it through winter. So the Ukrainians might actually have an opportunity to take advantage of that. That remains to be seen. Also, the Rasputitsa is ending. That's also a benefit for the Ukrainians as far as their offensive operations.
What's the Rasputitsa again?
That's the muddy season.
Oh, right.
So that actually, somewhat stupidly, the Russians actually launched their invasion during the spring Rasputitsa, way back in February. And as a result, they were largely forced to stick to roads, which made their forces much more vulnerable than they might have been otherwise. Right now, well, actually for the past, month or so, the fall Rasputitsa has been going on, and that's actually somewhat limited operations. You mentioned that things are going kind of slowly. Part of the reason is because it's the muddy season and it's kind of hard to move units around. Mm-hmm. But also neither side really has large units to kind of push anyway. At this point, it's largely smaller unit actions at a localized level. Like when the Ukrainians were pushing on Kherson, it wasn't a single concerted push. It was little pushes here and there where localized units saw opportunities. So incremental gains over time are very much more the defining character of the war at this point. Really, that was predominantly the character over much of the summer. The initial Russian offensive and then the Russian Donbass offensive have pretty much been the main big offensives. The Ukrainians were able to surprise everybody with a pretty big sweeping offensive of their own around Kharkiv not too long ago. But that had more to do with Russian weakness than necessarily Ukrainian strength. And similarly so with Kherson recently. Kherson was a slow incremental process. So the victory there was not like one big smash. It was kind of pinpricks, death by 1,000 cuts, so to speak. Mm-hmm. We'll see what happens in Donbass. That seems to be where they're shifting their focus. But the Ukrainians might surprise us with another offensive during the winter if they feel the Russians may be especially vulnerable, owing to the weather and whatnot. Oh, I did have some maps for you. Let me send you these. Send you these in Discord. Neuro. There you go. So that just illustrates all of the territory that has been taken over the past couple days by the Ukrainians. You can see it highlighted in blue there. Let's see. Ukraine. Oh, the grain deal is back on too. And I'm not sure if we mentioned that last time, but there had been talk about Russia ending the grain deal that they had signed with Ukraine. That was apparently re-implemented, so that's back on. Much to the relief of the developing world, which has been disproportionately hit by food inflation since earlier this year. Let's see, other than that, I did read an item saying that the Russians would have 120,000 conscripts ready for deployment by spring next year. So that actually puts them pretty close to the schedule that I'd read as far as how quickly they would be able to mobilize most of their conscripts in the event of mobilization. They were rushing through some earlier during that Ukrainian offensive in Kharkiv. So I do remember reading that some of them were only getting like a few weeks training. But I think most of the mobilized troops are still kind of receiving the normal regimen of training. The bulk of them anyway, that aren't being rushed through to hot areas of the front. So 120,000 is a lot. That's a big number. The Ukrainians are continuing their own mobilization efforts, and I'm sure they'll continue to receive support from the West. So it's not going to be a backbreaker, per se. And it's not as though conscripts are known for the efficacy of their fighting ability. So it could be that the Ukrainians have an advantage here. But the Ukrainians have a lot of conscripts of their own. They're much more motivated than Russian conscripts, I don't doubt that. But it may be that the Russians are going to just try to throw them at them in an effort to wear them down and try to force some kind of negotiated settlement favorable to Russia. It's worth pointing out, too, that a lot of the supplies coming from the West are strained at this point. The West has pretty well emptied out a lot of its inventories of weapons. At this point, the stuff that we're sending them, increasingly so over the course of the coming months and years, maybe, the stuff that we send Ukraine is going to have to be stuff that was built, that was new, not stuff that we had in the storage. And the trouble with that is that the productive capacity that the West had to produce a lot of that stuff is relatively limited, because it was not expected that we would need to produce a whole lot of new weapons over a short period of time. It was thought that if there was another modern war, it would be ended relatively quickly, and that it would largely be fought with established inventories. As it happens, it seems that that prediction was proven false, and certainly in the case of Ukraine. So now political economies in the West are having to really scramble to try to allocate resources to help manufacturers set up new manufacturing capacity in order to ensure that we can produce enough stuff for Ukraine going forward. But it's going to be a while before that new manufacturing capacity comes online. It's going to be hard enough just to get tooling and whatnot in place and to secure new sites and whatnot. It's probably going to be even harder to find labor. Labor is pretty short in the United States right now, and it's short in other areas of the Western world as well. So that could be a choke point that delays new deliveries going forward. So Ukraine could have an opportunity over the winter to try to make some gains, but in the spring, it could be that Russia has the leverage again. It could be there's a combination of a quantitative advantage on the part of, as a result of the 120,000 new conscripts, combined with increasingly sparse deliveries from the West to Ukraine. That could result in some more Russian momentum starting in spring. But I expect, from what I've read anyway, that by mid-2023 or so, and increasingly so after, that new productive capacity will come online and deliveries should resume and, in fact, increase to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, Ukraine should be able to get the momentum back if they can hang on.
Yeah, so basically people either gave or sold them everything in their garages, and their garages are empty, so they weren't able to keep giving them stuff, but they also turned on their production whenever the war started just to recoup the stuff that they were getting rid of.
Correct. That's exactly it.
I pulled the maps up here. It's looking like any area that's in blue or light blue was taken by Russia in the initial offensive, but then Ukraine has then retaken.
Oh, the deep blue is actually the river.
Oh.
It's a very big river.
Well.
And some of that is a reservoir. They dammed the river, and that created a backlog, basically, that makes the river look more like a lake.
So that's the fishes' territory then. Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
So the dark blue is the fishes. The light blue is Ukrainian counteroffensive retaking it. And then the white area would be it was never taken by Russia. And then the red is Russian controlled now.
Some of the white had been taken by Russia early in the war. I think this map specifically refers to positions from maybe like a week ago or so as the reference point. So a week ago, the Russians held all that light blue territory, and now the Ukrainians have taken all of that back.
Yeah, the conscript number, 120,000, that's a big number. But if they're not very experienced and not very well equipped, that's still not good for them.
Yeah, they're still suffering from an inability to produce and source all of the equipment and supplies they need. And even when they can get it, they're having trouble getting it to the front because Ukraine continues to hobble their logistics with targeted ranged fires, as well as partisan activity. Another thing I read is that there's a substantial amount of partisan activity in Zaporizhia, to the point that the Russians are having to divert some frontline units there to try to keep it tampered down. There's going to be some interesting stories from those partisans after the war is over, one way or the other. They're going to be pretty gruesome, I expect, from what I've heard about partisans in other wars, up to and including the Eastern Front in World War II. But full credit to them. It's a brave thing to take on a modern army, even one as weirdly ineffectual as the Russian army.
I did get to play a couple Dota games with Bitter Sugar, our friend from Ukraine.
Cool.
Yeah.
How's he doing?
He's doing pretty well. I think he recently got a little bit sick, just like normal seasonal illness, but he's gotten better from that. And he was saying that they've been cycling their power where you'll get electricity for about 3 hours window of time, and then it'll be cycled out and then cycled back in just so they can conserve power. And he's in Kyiv. So that was why I asked about the winter stuff.
Yeah, electricity is going to be a bigger problem than natural gas. That's a good point. And the Russians have been going out of their way the past month or two to try to target energy infrastructure in Ukraine. In fact, in Kherson, that they just evacuated, they actually disabled most of the city's infrastructure. So power infrastructure, water treatment infrastructure, a lot of that has been damaged, destroyed, or sabotaged. Or maybe not sabotaged, but booby-trapped. Is that the word I want? I'm sure there's a more professional name for it.
It was booby-trapped.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a real thing, too. There's a considerable number of mines that the Russians left in their wake, so there's going to be a lot of demining in the region's future. But yeah, fair point about the electricity. They'll be able to get the electricity they need from the West if they need it, but the issue right now is that the infrastructure has been damaged. So how quickly they can fix that damage and the degree to which they can prevent the Russians from, damaging further infrastructure, that'll determine the degree to which they're able to kind of maintain that. That is to say, keep the lights on. Well, the only other item I had here as far as Ukraine is Brittany Griner, the WNBA star. Do you remember her?
Yep. She got thrown in jail for having weed.
Well, more specifically, it was like a vape thing. Like you've got the marijuana vape cartridges.
Yep.
I think that was more specifically what got her in trouble. Well, negotiations have been ongoing between the Russian and American governments to secure her release. But it seems that those negotiations have stalled out, and at this point, the most recent news is that she was moved to a penal colony, which in Russia are not very nice places to be. The way it was described to me, or at least was described in an article, rather, was that they're holdovers from the Stalin era. They're basically just short of concentration camps, effectively. So she's probably going to lose some weight. Probably undergo some other hardships there. It'll be tough. Hopefully they can get her out sooner rather than later, but the Russians are obviously not eager to let her go without getting something substantive in compensation.
Yeah.
Did I do the usual disclaimer?
You did not. Would you like to?
I did not. Let me throw that out there before I forget again. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. More painfully obvious at some times than in others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I don't read chat while we do this, so I won't see it now, but I will read chat later. And I do enjoy the feedback we get in chat, as well as the little debates and all the little bits of information that people drop. So yeah, feedback is encouraged in that regard. Let's see, that's about all I had for Ukraine. Did you hear about Ethiopia?
Not since we talked about it last time.
Well, much to my surprise, since I was expecting some very difficult fighting for several months, maybe a brief review is in order. The last time we talked about this, the Ethiopian army, in conjunction with their allies, the Eritrean army, in conjunction with further allies in the form of local militias, largely Amhara in nature, as I recall. All of them were together launching an offensive into Tigray territory. And the TPLF, the Tigray party in control of Tigray, controlling the Tigray military, controlling the Tigray war effort, rather, was kind of on the back foot. And it was looking like there would be a pretty grueling fight as the armed forces of the government and its allies slowly pushed through the territory trying to defeat the TPLF, which is run by a pretty effective general and has been pretty resilient in the past. For those who don't remember, government forces actually overran Tigray province in the opening days of the war, but were later pushed out by guerrilla activity. So I did not have high expectations, but much to my surprise, a truce was announced, and it looks like a substantive peace agreement is in the offing. And when I say substantive, I do mean it, because it sounds all the world like the TPLF has made a credible commitment to outright disarm, which shocked the hell out of me, and it also surprised a lot of the analysts that I was reading who were talking about it. So not only has there been a truce and a peace agreement in the process of being negotiated, part of that agreement involves the TPLF, one of the major combatants in the war, agreeing to just disarm and basically recognize the integrity of Ethiopia, which had been one of the main asks of the Ethiopian government. They were accusing the TPLF of threatening the territorial integrity of Ethiopia by effectively trying to break off a province. So now that is completely off the table. The TPLF is effectively going to have to lose any ability to defend itself or arm itself, and is going to have to respect the authority of the central government going forward. And the promises that have been made thus far seem credible. And from what I was reading, the TPLF is already in the process of disarming and honoring that agreement to do so. So it seems that the war may well be over. Which is going to be great news for the people involved, because Ethiopia is a country of 100 million people, and even just in Tigray, there's several million people living there. And Tigray in particular was negatively impacted because they had been all but cut off from the outside world, not only from imports of things like food and supplies and whatnot, but they'd also been prevented from receiving any humanitarian aid by the government. And so the result is that there were famine conditions in Tigray, a significant amount of food insecurity. And one of the conditions of the truce is that Tigray has been completely opened up to humanitarian aid. And from what I've read, humanitarian aid, specifically in the form of food and other supplies, has been flooding in. So that's a great relief to the people of Tigray, and hopefully there will not be any recriminations or retribution by government forces or aligned militia forces against the people of Tigray province going forward. That had been one of the things people were worried about. But so far, so good. So you can chalk that up as further good news.
How long did the war last overall?
It started in mid-2020, roughly. So it's been going on for 2+ years now. And given how populated Ethiopia is, there's a considerable number of people who are affected by it. So again, this is a great relief for all parties involved. It's definitely not what Ethiopia needs right now, especially given the country is in the middle of a drought. And it's not well disposed to be able to handle it. So peace is coming at a very opportune time. Hopefully it sticks. Yeah, very much it seems like an outright defeat for the TPLF. They'd very much been pushing hard for autonomy, maybe even independence. And given how successful they were in the early part of the war, to the point where there was even concern they might actually take the capital of Ethiopia at one point, it kind of seemed like they were well on their way to getting what they wanted. So this is a pretty significant turnaround. You know, they've all but capitulated, it seems, in the face of government pressure. I suspect hunger also played a role. You know, the degree of the lack of humanitarian assistance, the drought, the lack of things like fertilizer and other needed supplies, that was probably putting an immense amount of economic pressure on the province as well. So a government win. Hopefully they're able to use it to good effect. Well, let's see. How are we doing on time?
Good, got another hour left.
Gotcha.
There was a question from the chat. Any news on the European farmer protests?
Farmer protest? I hadn't heard about any. None popped up on the BBC anyway. let's see, July. There was some in July in the Netherlands. I'm guessing they're more recent ones, though.
I see September. The most recent I see is September.
Farm. I've heard about some protests in Europe, but they've had more to do with things like inflation, generally. I haven't heard anything about farmers specifically, though, so I'm sorry, I can't answer the question. That's not very satisfying, I'm sure. But yeah, given that I haven't really read much about it, I'd appreciate some kind of reference point if the person asking has any, just like a link or something, so I could learn about it.
I think, was there anything else that jumped out at me this week in terms of news? There's like all the Twitter stuff, which just seems like tabloids, really.
Yeah, I mean, Elon Musk, he said himself that he was going to make mistakes in the early, months. So, that's not surprising, but some of the naivete on display has been somewhat humorous.
Mm-hmm.
The blue check stuff in particular has been the source of no small amount of humor.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen some of those on Reddit.
I haven't seen that many specific examples, but I did hear that people are just getting a check mark of some celebrity or whatever and then trolling people with it.
Oh, man. There was a guy faking, what was it? He set up a Twitter account pretending to be George W. Bush, and he started posting about how he missed killing Iraqis.
What the hell?
There's a lot of stuff like that. Some people impersonating corporate brands, companies and whatnot, and then posting stuff that those brands are not going to like. Suffice to say. So yeah, there's a lot of humorous examples there of how that policy was not the way to go.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see what happens. It would be unfortunate if Twitter imploded. I'm actually getting some utility out of it at this point. It can actually be a pretty decent source of information if you curate it correctly. Like, most of my subscriptions are to think tanks and stuff, and whenever I open it up, I'm always getting lots of insightful stuff from top-notch analysts and think tanks, so I actually do appreciate that. And there was a long period of time, many years, when I just refused to use Twitter. And even when I eventually got on as part of this segment, like, I only really just posted articles and stuff. So actually having it as a useful source of information is kind of a novel thing. And just my luck that the whole website might collapse only a year or so after I finally started getting real usage out of it.
And we'll see how that goes.
Yeah. I'm sure it'll be a circus. Well, did you hear about the assassination attempt on Imran Khan in Pakistan?
No.
Do you remember this guy? It's been a while since we talked about him.
Imran Khan. I could use a refresh.
Okay, he's the former prime minister of Pakistan. He had been in power for several years. He was largely only in power due to a sort of de facto alliance with the Pakistani army, which is the real power in Pakistan's politics. But eventually there was a falling out, and Imran Khan did not take it very well. So the Pakistani army used its avatar in Pakistan's politics at this point, which was sort of a right-wing Islamist political party, to start protesting against Khan and his government, and there was a corruption scandal and this, that, and the other. So eventually Khan was impeached by his rivals. But he did not go quietly. He started accusing the government of conspiring against him. He accused the United States of conspiring against him. And he encouraged his followers to hit the streets and start protesting to try to get him reinstated, back into power. The Pakistani army, for its part, tried to just ignore it for a long time. They're sort of in the habit of kind of getting their way in Pakistan's politics. So they basically conspired to get rid of Khan and then made an alliance with one of their off-again, on-again rival/allies, a guy named Nawaz Sharif, the head of a party in Pakistan called Muslim League In, basically. It's The origins of the name are a little complicated, but basically it's Muslim League in. And he was basically installed into power and made the new prime minister. But very few people in Pakistan were very happy about that. It was pretty obvious to everybody that Khan was getting railroaded. And somewhat unusually, they actually started to mass protest. There were people coming out and starting to demand that the Pakistani government, and more specifically the military, stop meddling and allow Khan to become prime minister again and do his job. And the army is still kind of ignoring it, but it seems they're starting to take it more seriously because there was a substantive assassination attempt on Khan recently. It was unsuccessful, but he did get shot in the leg, I think it was. Or maybe it was stabbed, I don't quite remember. He survived, he's recovering, and it seems like the guy who was responsible for the assassination attempt, he was caught very quickly. It kind of seems like he might have just been a crazy guy. So, maybe it was just somebody acting on his own volition. But in Pakistani politics, people are very rarely willing to extend the benefit of the doubt. Conspiracies are considered more the norm. So there's a very strong suspicion amongst commentators that the Pakistani army had something to do with it somehow. Even if they didn't, it's not really beyond the scope of what the Pakistani army is capable of. In other words, they've done it before. And it could be that the pressure is getting to the point where they might do it again. So Pakistani politics is getting very interesting, even more so than it already was. And the country is already under a lot of pressure. Those big floods did a lot of damage recently. I'm sure you remember those. And then the economy is also under pressure just from a lack of electricity, owing to an inability to import sufficient supplies of natural gas, which at this point is very expensive and in relatively short supply on account of the war in Ukraine. So Pakistan definitely under pressure at this point. It's not really in the news much because it's in South Asia. People don't really pay much attention to events in South Asia one way or the other. But you might be reading about it in the news soon if things continue to escalate. It is still a nuclear-armed country. It's not a very wealthy one, but they do have nukes. So if the country destabilizes, that could be a problem. Could also have some consequence for Afghanistan. If the Pakistani military, and it's more specifically the ISI, doesn't have the resources to exert influence in Afghanistan, that could free up the Taliban and other actors in Afghanistan to try to chart their own course, which could result in violence or maybe not, just depending on how the different actors respond to that opportunity. Let's see. And that's about all I had on it, but something to keep an eye on. Was there any particular topic you wanted to hit on? I've got more, but I wanted to ask.
I don't think so. I don't think there was anything else that jumped out at me.
Did we have any questions? I don't think we've been taking any, have we?
Yeah, just the one I already read to you.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, the other stuff I was going to mention had to do with the economy. There's been some economic news more recently. Let me see if I can find it first. Ethiopia. Oh, yeah. So there was another economic report from the Fed, and the news is relatively good. Inflation is down some. I think it was something like just short of 8%, and it had been well over 8% in the last report. So the inflation rate is still high, but it's at least coming down, which is a positive trend for, everybody. Everybody's pretty concerned about that. Employment also surprisingly robust. There's still a lot of jobs being added to the economy, which is weird because the unemployment rate is already pretty low, which kind of begs the question of just where these people are coming from. So the suspicion is that the labor force participation rate is going up. If you don't know what the labor force participation rate is, that's just the percentage of the population that is in the workforce. And in order to be counted as a member of the workforce, you either have to have a job or you have to be looking for one. So having more people looking for work, or at least participating in the economy, that's going to be a net positive, and that suggests more people have relatively more confidence. I know it sounds weird to think of people as having confidence in the economy or for the economy to be doing well at all, but it actually is doing relatively well if you just go by the numbers. I know it doesn't feel like it because of all the inflation and whatnot, but this is actually what an economy that is running hot looks like. Stuff gets more expensive because people are making more money and spending more. And from what I've read, spending hasn't really abated much. Even in spite of the price rises, people are still spending a lot of money. They're still having to borrow more money to do it, but overall consumption seems to be holding out against the pressure thus far. We'll see how long that lasts. Price hikes are going to start taking an effect probably next couple of months or so. It's kind of a delayed effect. It takes a while. But they are starting to have an effect, at least for the moment, in some parts of the economy. So that's actually the next thing I was going to talk about. What has been the impact of interest rate hikes? So I don't know if you've heard about it or read about it. I know you're kind of attuned more to the tech world since you kind of work in a stream here. But have you heard about the drama in the tech sector generally lately?
No.
Well, there's been pretty considerable drama owing to mass layoffs. The tech industry has done very well, for the past couple decades. Even through the Great Recession and through the pandemic, the tech sector was pretty resilient, to those headwinds. And they were expecting the good times to keep coming, but there's been a lot of downward pressure on earnings and a lot of failed investment projects, basically, that have started to turn the tables to the point where even the biggest tech firms at this point are laying off a lot of workers. They're just feeling the pressure. So it seems like it's not necessarily the case that they're not going to keep growing in future, but at the very least, they're going to enter at the very least a short period of shrinkage here. They're going to shrink their payrolls, and they're going to shrink their ambitions. They're going to be trying to pull back from some of the more adventurous investments that they've been making. Now, again, a lot of that is just due to overreach. A lot of them just had overly rosy estimates of how much demand would continue to grow, and by extension, their revenues. So this is kind of more of a calibration in that sense. But part of the reason that they're having to kind of retrench here is because of the interest rate hikes. The tech sector has been a beneficiary of the low interest rate environment the U.S. economy has been in for an extended period of time. Investors, because interest rates have been so low, have been much more tolerant of risk in their investment portfolio. Normally you would try to put more of your portfolio in less risky assets, and that generally means stuff that's fixed rate, stuff like bonds and other kinds of assets like that. But because interest rates are so low, interest rates on those safe securities have been correspondingly low, and that's made them correspondingly less attractive. And the result then has been that investors have been desperate for returns to the point where they've been willing to take on more risk. And that's meant putting a lot more money in the tech sector, despite the fact that a lot of firms there have been struggling to actually generate substantive revenue. But even in spite of that, tech firms are never short of projects. They're never short of hype. They've always got ideas about how to do things differently or new investment projects that they dream up. And so they were attractive investment vectors for all of that money seeking returns. But now that interest rates are going up, investors don't have to be quite so risk tolerant. They've been able to start redistributing their portfolios away from those riskier investments. And that's made borrowing money and getting money in general much more difficult for the tech firms. So this is a big realignment for them, financially speaking. And again, it's not necessarily the end of the world. This isn't necessarily like the end of a long period of growth. They could start growing again, just depending on how the fundamentals shake out. But again, for the moment, they've definitely overreached, and they're having to recalibrate accordingly. And the rate hikes are just a part of that process, or a contributing factor there. So let's see, another implication here, another consequence of interest rate hikes has been that the housing markets in the United States have finally started to hit a hitch. They've started to decline. It's not too much right now, but you're starting to see some markets where prices are falling. And from what I've heard, because I actually do know somebody who works in real estate, according to my source, so to speak, the cash buyer market, as well as some of the buyers on places like Zillow, who are basically the same thing, that market has all but imploded at this point. You know, those buyers are increasingly scarce in the housing market, and that's resulted in a significant decline in demand in the market. So again, there's kind of a delayed effect here in the housing market for shifts in demand and supply because of the way contracts and rents are set up. But you are starting to see the bleeding edge of the declines, and there's going to be more. You know, that was a big market. The cash buyer market was pretty big there for a long time. So the fact that it's dried up is going to have a significant impact. Also, there's probably going to be some bleed over from the implosion of a lot of the tech sector. Well, implosion is too strong a word, but the retrenchment, let's say, in the tech sector. One of the reasons that the housing market had been doing so well is because of the tech sector specifically. I heard in an NPR, on NPR, that there was a report released that attributed as much as half of the increase in home prices since 2020 to the work from home shift, which was not exclusively driven by the tech sector, but the tech sector was disproportionately a driver of that. And in so much as the tech sector has disproportionately benefited and been, exposed to the shift from the work from home shift, they've been in a unique position to drive demand for housing. And because that demand was so robust during the pandemic, they were able to help float the market then, which is one of the reasons why it increased so much at that time and in the years since. So now that the tech sector is finally suffering a decline, as mild as it may relatively be, that could be part of the reason that housing prices are going to decline in future. That driver of the market is now going to decline in its intensity. So you would expect corresponding declines in prices to reflect that. So that again is part of that increase in rates, because demand for rates is a big part of that. A big part of determining prices for houses and how easy it is to get mortgages and all that kind of stuff. So higher rates means invariably less demand for housing. So let's see, the third item here, and this is kind of a technical one, but it could be important later. There's been wobbles in the Treasury market, and that's kind of a weird turn of phrase, but basically the market for Treasury bonds, which are the debt issuance. It is the form of debt that the U.S. government issues when it wants to borrow money. So Treasury bonds have their own market, and increasingly the primary market has been a little wonky. When the government has been issuing debt to try to borrow money, they've been having some trouble finding buyers, which is a little unusual. There have been times when the Federal Reserve has had to intervene in the market over the past year or two. It hasn't been a big problem. The secondary market is still pretty robust. At least I haven't heard otherwise. But it seems the market is sufficiently saturated at this point that there's not as many willing buyers as there used to be. Another factor here, and this factor kind of makes me not really worry about it as much as some other people online that I've been reading. But the other factor is that there are expectations that rates will continue to rise. And, not to go too deeply into it, but basically when interest rates go up, the value of bonds go down. I think that's how it works. Maybe I'm getting confused again. But roughly that's how the market works. It's inverted, basically. Yeah, if interest rates go down, then you're not going to be able to resell your bond for as much, or up rather. When interest rates go up, you're not going to be able to resell your bond for as much, and then vice versa. Am I getting that wrong? I feel like I'm getting that confused. I'm not super familiar with Treasury markets, so sometimes I get tripped up on them. But the main thing anyway is that basically because interest rates are inverted like that and interest rates are expected to go up, a lot of buyers are a little gun shy about buying into the market right now. When you expect something to fall in value, you don't want to buy it right now. You want to buy it after it falls in value. So that's part of the reason that there's not as many buyers for treasury bonds right now. Some of the market would buy, but they're a little concerned because they think they're going to lose value if they buy right now. So once we get to a point where interest rate hikes are not expected to be as dramatic, or maybe even are expected to stop, probably then the market recovers, I would expect. That's my intuition anyway. But in the meantime, we're going to see some wobbles here, and that's led to some people speculating about the health of the treasury market and whether or not the market is too saturated, and whether or not there might be corresponding impacts on things like the value of the US dollar and also the weight of interest payments on existing debt as well as future debt. Because if you can't find buyers, then invariably you're going to have to raise interest rates even more and pay more on the interest for those loans.
So some moves in the market. Seems like we're in the aftermath of a lot of the big tech boom stuff, and things are getting back to earth. There was also some questions in the chat about a crypto crash recently.
Oh, yeah, that was... I don't follow crypto super closely. Some of you who have been listening for a long time probably already know that. We got a lot of crypto questions way back in 2017 when we started. And I wasn't really well positioned to answer the more technical of them. As an economist, I've always been pretty skeptical about crypto because it seems to trade more as a commodity than anything. And also, established currencies are generally have the confidence of merchants, the established traders, financiers, what have you. And those guys are easily the main drivers of commerce. So, if they lost confidence in currency and started using crypto, then I could believe it, but I haven't seen any indication of that. So what happened recently is that one of the largest, I think it was an exchange called FTX, they've just collapsed. They've had to declare bankruptcy, and they're having to reorganize assets and sell them off, and all the usual bankruptcy rigmarole. But it was a big moment because a lot of people, it was one of the larger exchanges, and a lot of the investors had money there, up to and including retail investors. So a collapse in FTX is really harmful as far as market confidence in the industry as a whole, because that was easily one of their lodestars, from what I've read. Again, haven't followed crypto too much, but I was reading about it more recently on account of all the drama in the market recently. But yeah, crypto is kind of in the doghouse right now. There have been periods when crypto lost value, and when confidence in cryptocurrencies generally were kind of in decline, but invariably they recovered because those were generally pretty transient shifts in the market. But this doesn't seem transient. This kind of seems more like, and you could maybe qualify this as one of the things that the interest rate hikes have caused, or at least contributed to. Because it could be that there was a lot of people who were putting the risky part of their portfolio into cryptocurrency, but now that rates are hiking, there are better opportunities elsewhere that are less risky. So that could have contributed to a giant withdrawal of money from the market that has contributed to a collapse in a number of currencies, or at least a collapse in their value. Again, it just kind of trades more like a commodity than anything else.
Pokemon cards.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me that it behaves like this. But a lot of people are getting caught out. A lot of people put a lot of their money in and aren't going to be able to get it back, or at least won't be able to get it back for a while, depending on how the restructuring and the bankruptcy proceedings go. But yeah, it's been big news in the tech sector, from what I've read. A lot of people have been surprised by how rapidly the collapse happened, and the massive amount of value that's been lost in that particular investment area. But I couldn't give you details beyond that. It'll probably stay around. I don't think it's going to disappear, that is to say, cryptocurrencies. And I've heard people make arguments that stable coins in particular have much more staying power. But I still don't expect them to ever, overtake established currencies or anything like that. I think it's always going to be a niche investment for people who are looking for something risky to invest in that might have a high return, and also for libertarians looking for a place to put their money that the government can't quite get to. I suspect they in particular are big investors in cryptocurrencies. And of course, criminals. They also enjoy the value of cryptocurrencies and the inability of states to track them. So that's obviously also a very robust source of demand.
I think a lot of the initial hype and expectation was that cryptocurrencies would replace fiat currencies.
Yeah.
And then it was just like, people just need to get on the bandwagon because this is how it's going to be now. And Bitcoin got to like insane levels of value. A lot of people, if they sold at its apex, could have made a crap ton of money, but then it crashed super hard after that. So
Oh, yeah.
maybe we've learned, maybe we have not.
No.
No, you don't think we
No.
have?
No. It's still a highly speculative market, and there's still a lot of people who are, I don't want to say paranoid per se, because it's not as though the fiscal situation right now in a lot of large countries is the best. But there's a lot of people who are sufficiently concerned about the stability of established currencies that there's probably still going to be a lot of people putting money into cryptocurrencies. They might be more interested in the more stable currencies, like the stable coins and whatnot. But yeah, I don't think it's going to go away. I think there's still going to be a lot of churn in the market. I would also point out that there's still a shortage of regulation in that particular space. And so that just invariably invites things like bubbles and manipulation, fraud, what have you. So that's probably also going to ensure that there's continued churn in the market going forward, even after it recovers from this. So a little crypto commentary there,
Yeah.
2017 style.
Hey, can you ask Agent Smith what his thoughts are on crypto? Right as crypto was getting big, we got that question every week without fail, sometimes multiple times, because people, they wanted to know if like, he seems like a pretty smart guy. Maybe he knows this is like going to be the next big thing and I could get rich. Does he know about it? Just asking for a friend, because I would like to be super rich.
Sometimes I can be smart, but I would never trust myself with somebody else's money. So if you want financial advice, get it from a professional. Well, let's see. I did have more stuff there. We've still got half an hour, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about China's economy a little bit. I had some notes on that. But I also wanted to mention quickly Ontario, the province up in Canada. I did read about them in the news because apparently there's been something of a standoff in Ontario between the provincial government and with the main teachers union in the province, or maybe the only one. I don't know how teachers unions work in Canada. But in order to avoid a strike, the provincial government actually resorted to threatening to fine strikers. And it was noted, actually, I could just give you the quote. I thought this quote is basically the only reason I mentioned this. The quote from the article is, "The government acknowledges its bill breaches the country's Charter of Rights and Freedoms and Human Rights Code, but says its priority is averting a strike." End quote. So that quote has a lot of 2020s energy, I felt. And it kind of establishes that Canada does have its fair share of populism. It's just that it hasn't really been as successful at the national level as it has at the provincial level. Yeah, apparently the province is predicating that threat on something called the notwithstanding clause. And that allows governments to override certain portions of the charter. I mentioned the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for a 5-year time period under certain circumstances. But the fact, well, the wording of the quote in particular, but also the fact that Ontario is going so hard against a teachers union Just, it felt notable. I thought I'd throw that out there. A sign of the times, if you like. Okay. So that said, so what's going on with China's economy? Some good and bad news, basically. So before I get into this, it's worth mentioning that China's economy is the second largest economy on the planet. So whatever happens with China's economy is going to have a big knock-on effect for everybody else. The US economy is still more important, but China's not too far behind. So whatever happens there is invariably going to affect the United States as well. So it's worth paying attention to this. So one of the biggest news items was that the Chinese government made an announcement that signaled, they didn't explicitly say as much, but they're signaling that they're going to start rolling back their zero COVID policy. So this is the policy by which the Chinese government has been trying to ensure that there is zero transmission of COVID-19 within China, which is a very ambitious goal given how contagious the disease is. And they haven't really been meeting with too much luck. Basically, as COVID-19 has mutated, it's slowly been getting more contagious. And there's been more and more incidents of it popping up in China over time, much to the detriment of the Chinese economy, since they still respond to each outbreak with hammer, basically. Very strong quarantines, lockdowns, etc. And this was having an increasingly deleterious effect on the Chinese economy. But now it looks like they're going to start moving in a different direction. Some of the specific changes that they've announced, although still not implemented as of yet, they've announced that inbound travelers will not have to quarantine for 7 days. Now it's down to 5 days. Still a lot, but it's in the right direction at least. They also had a circuit breaker, quote unquote, mechanism for inbound flights. Basically, if a critical mass of passengers on a given flight were found to be infected, the flight would be canceled and forced to turn around. So that's ending. They're going to stop that mechanism now. Again, this is still a promise. This is still just an announcement. They haven't actually done this, but they've at least announced that they're going to end this practice. They've also said that pre-departure tests, the requirement for pre-departure tests will be reduced from 2 to 1. So before you had to have 2 tests proving that you were clear, that is to say not infected by COVID-19, now you'll just need the 1 test. So these are still pretty intrusive measures that are going to be in place, but again, less so over time, it seems. So some other, it's worth mentioning too that Chinese financial markets rallied on these announcements. So, investors not only in China but outside of China had been pretty down on investing in China over the past couple months because it kind of seemed like zero COVID might be a semi-permanent feature and that the government was not going to change course. And combine that with some negative economic data, and investors were getting pretty bearish on China. But with these announcements, there's been a resurgence in interest. Investment seems to be up. There's renewed interest, etc. So all for the better as far as China's economic outlook. Let's see. So some of those headwinds I mentioned specifically, export data was softening. In other words, exports seem to be in the decline. That's pretty much in keeping with the overall decline in the international market as a whole, which of course Chinese exports are closely tied to. Also, housing construction has continued to decline, which is an important economic activity for China's manufacturing sector. So that also kind of bodes ill well for the immediate future of China's economy. And I saw it mentioned too by one analyst that despite the fact that credit in general has been made cheaper and more available to consumers, consumers are not borrowing more. It seems that they're very averse to that at this point. They're preferring to save money rather than spend, or certainly not borrow and spend. So that suggests that there's a consumer sentiment problem, which is, again, not surprising. But that suggests that consumption is going to take a hit, either stagnate or probably start to decline, which again suggests a negative outlook for China's economy. Some of that might change with the zero COVID stuff ebbing, but we'll see. That won't zero COVID ending won't necessarily reverse the decline in international economic activity. So exports won't necessarily recover because of that. Maybe housing might recover a little bit if consumer sentiment improves, but that remains to be seen. So keep your eye on that space. There has been some government action, of course, over the past year or two, as far as the government trying to goose the economy, trying to stimulate it in order to get more activity happening. Some of that is activity that's designed to counteract COVID-19 lockdowns, but most of it over the past year has been focused on trying to stimulate the housing sector, which has been in decline since the Chinese government implemented in 2021 a number of lending restrictions that were designed to inhibit the flow of capital to the construction sector and more specifically to the real estate sector, which the Chinese government felt was overheating and needed to be brought under control. That effort does not seem to have worked all that well. It was successful in arresting price increases in large part. Not everywhere. Beijing housing prices have not really changed much from what I've heard, but in other parts of the country, they have changed to varying degrees. The issue now, though, is that they've been a little too successful to the point that construction in general has declined on a broad basis. And because that's such an important part of China's economy, the overall economy is suffering for it. So now the Chinese government, rather, is having to kind of do a 180 and is now looking for ways to restore confidence in the real estate sector and try to generate more demand. They're still trying to do it without inflating a bubble, which is kind of what they were concerned about in the first place and what was leading them to try to tamp down on the sector. But now they're kind of having to thread the needle and prevent a collapse in construction while they do that. A difficult challenge, but they seem to be managing it thus far. So one of the things they did is that they directed policy banks in China, which are basically these big state-backed banks in China that own lots and lots of assets and are disproportionately responsible for lending, especially to large economic entities, generally state-backed firms of other varieties, but also private sector firms that are particularly large. So the government really leaned on these banks to try to lend more to the real estate sector in particular, but also to other areas of the economy that have been struggling. The government of China frequently responds to economic downturns by just having banks, both state-backed and private sector banks, significantly increase lending, generally to state-owned entities for the most part. And the idea there is to just try to significantly ramp up employment in order to soak up unemployment caused by the downturn. So this is a textbook response for them. This isn't really a surprise. But the scale is very large. 300 billion yuan has been allocated for this program, which is a significant amount. It's not as much as you might think. You know, the yuan is only worth 1/7 of a dollar, but for China, that's a significant investment there into this traditional mechanism by which they have tried to deflect economic downturns. Let's see, they've also been trying to encourage local governments to try to increase demand for housing as much as possible. Housing at a local level, well, I should say localities, local government has been trying to encourage people to buy homes in bulk. In some cases, the localities themselves have actually been buying housing in bulk. And state-owned enterprises have also been encouraged to kind of participate in that. So that illustrates how much China and the Chinese government is trying to boost demand in the real estate sector.
They're trying to get who to buy houses in bulk?
Local governments.
Oh, I thought you were talking about individuals at first, and I was like, look, I know you want to buy a house for you and your family, but what if you bought 5 houses?
Well, it's the local governments that are encouraging people to buy, but the local governments themselves are also trying to buy in bulk. And state-owned enterprises have been encouraged to do the same. So those are the ones that are trying to hoover up some of these houses. And again, the idea there is just to try to get more money into the sector to try to prevent it from further collapsing. From a public policy perspective, that's basically what I would call a gimmick. That's not really something that's going to really work, at least not by itself. But it illustrates that the Chinese government is taking what you would call a whole-of-government approach to address this issue, which both suggests how serious it is, but also how seriously the Chinese government is taking it. You know, they're really pulling out all the stops here and doing everything they can. And given how many resources the Chinese government has access to, when they do something on this broad a scale, it's a pretty good bet that they'll be able to deal with it. You know, I don't doubt that there's going to be problems that'll continue on. You know, the Chinese government isn't that good, but I have confidence that they'll be able to prevent something like a major real estate collapse, or even a construction industry collapse, such that the manufacturing sector would significantly be impaired. So overall, China's economy will be fine. The downside will be things like moral hazard, because what they've done is basically had to bail out a lot of industries. And the effect of that is going to be deleterious in the long run. You know, they've yet to really establish that individual economic actors at a local level need to really be careful with how they use their money, because everybody's seen that if you're well connected enough, you can get bailed out by the government. So that suggests that while they might be able to avoid short-term economic disaster, it's going to come at the cost at a continuing inability of major actors in the China's economy to effectively and productively invest money. We've talked before about how one of the major disadvantages China's economy has is that a lot of the investment money that they continue to pour into the economy, both from state actors and private actors, continues to largely be used unproductively, with the result that you end up with these weird kinds of bubbles and unproductive investment and loans that are non-performing and all this kind of thing. So it's going to be a net drag on them over the long term, even if over the short term it comes with some benefits. For now, they've decided to kick the can down the road on addressing that particular problem. For now, they're saying that it's more important to arrest the decline in the real estate sector than it is to fix this overarching productivity problem. So with that in mind, there was a new plan that was announced just recently, I think sometime in the past 48 hours, that the government announced that is basically a targeted effort to prop up the real estate industry. Now, up till now, they've been relying on gimmicks, things like, pushing localities to try to buy housing, and they've been very, very interventionist as far as trying to manage how a lot of bankrupt real estate firms have been managing their assets as a part of what is in effect a de facto set of bankruptcy proceedings. But they haven't really resorted yet to reversing course on some of the lending restrictions that had been put in place in 2021. They were still trying to keep those in place while managing the decline of the industry. The most recent bailout plan that I've read about just in the past few hours, actually, they've basically kind of given that up. The 2021 restrictions are going to be kept in place, but they're going to be significantly watered down, at least temporarily. But in effect, the government is admitting that those restrictions went too far and that the industry needs more robust supports in place in order to kind of make it through this. So I was going to kind of talk through some of those. Some of the items listed in the plan are explicit reversals. So, for example, lenders are not supposed to discriminate between state-owned and private developers. Basically, historically, you're supposed to favor state-owned enterprises. That's not a written rule, but if you don't do it, generally you're punished. So the government is coming out and saying explicitly here, private sector actors should get attention, both from public policy institutions, local governments and state governments, but they're also saying that lenders basically have permission to once again prioritize private sector developers as needed. And some of the as needed aspect of that is outlined in some of the other stuff they're outlining here. We'll get to that in a minute. But a more explicit reversal here was that they're saying that some of the 2021 lending restrictions on the real estate sector, and more specifically on lending to the real estate sector, will be temporarily suspended. And they've also said that those firms that were in breach of the 2021 restrictions on lending to the real estate sector will now be allocated additional time to adjust to that. So basically, they're not going to have to divest themselves of these loans and properties and whatnot. They're going to have extra time to do that. And ideally, that'll take some of those properties off the market and relax some of the price pressure on the industry. So those are some of the most obvious examples of reversals there as far as the real estate sector. Most of the items I noted, well, most of the items I read, I thought were largely categorized as subsidies. So on the supply side, they gave some implicit or explicit subsidies to developers, lenders, and construction firms. To the developers, the government has said that it will fully back the bonds of what it calls quote unquote quality developers. Now, this is probably the most explicit subsidy on the list. Basically, the government is saying that if you're a lender, if you're a developer rather, who is struggling with your debt, so long as your balance sheet is sufficiently strong and the government doesn't think you were screwing around too much in the lead up to this decline, the government will just full on bail you out. It's just going to buy your debt and will just float you completely. They've also said that they're going to give loan support, probably through indirect pressure on state-owned banks of one kind or another. They're going to give loan support to existing housing projects. So one of the problems that's existed in this crisis is that a lot of construction firms borrowed money to build stuff, but then were unable to build it because they just pocketed the money and were hoping to borrow money to pay the actual costs of the construction project. When the 2021 restrictions were put in place, those firms were no longer able to secure that financing, and it meant that they could not finish existing projects. Now, that's obviously had knock-on effects for the broader economy, but more specifically for consumers who invested in those projects, it meant that they couldn't get their investment back because the project couldn't complete. So the government is now stepping in and is trying to address this problem directly by directing institutions to lend money to these firms in these specific circumstances so that they will be able to finish those projects. They won't necessarily be able to start new projects. That's not what this aspect of the plan is meant to do. More specifically, they're just targeting this specific problem with incomplete housing projects. So policy banks, like the state-owned banks basically that I mentioned, they're directed to help with this. But also private sector banks are also receiving quote unquote encouragement in order to help deal with this problem. So those are all direct and indirect subsidies to developers. As far as lenders, regulations on financing property acquisitions are set to be loosened, which is a de facto subsidy. Lenders are also going to be encouraged to, one, lend to firms owning rental properties, and two, lend to firms that are in the process of building rental properties. So the idea there is to try to relieve some of the pressure on people who have been hit by the rapid increase in housing prices. Renters are disproportionately affected because their rents can be increased dramatically very quickly. So the government here is trying to incentivize lenders in a way, is trying to incentivize the construction of rental housing in order to put downward pressure on rents. And then they're also going to, maybe not force, but apparently they're putting pressure on the financial industry in China to trial run what are called REITs, rights. And these are basically investment funds that specialize in buying up housing and then basically lending it out. They buy the housing and then people pay rents when they rent the housing, and then that money flows to the investors. And this sounds very risky. I'm sure it reminds people of the 2008 financial crisis, but rights actually can be well run. They're a normal part of the American financial system, the European financial system. And so it seems that the Chinese government is trying to get the Chinese financial sector to develop this product in order to help create more demand for housing, in order to try to get more housing out there, both to relieve the pressure on consumers so that there's more supply and lower prices, but also to try to relieve the pressure on construction firms and real estate firms so that they can start getting more money back into the industry and relieve some of the debt pressure the industry is facing. So different steps here basically to try to get lenders to participate in this process of relieving the real estate sector in different ways, but also consumers. As for construction firms, lenders are being encouraged to ensure that construction firms have the needed financing, will have the financing that they need. So basically, construction firms have been hit by the real estate downturn too, and the government is just saying here that it wants lenders, where they can and when the firm has sufficiently strong balance sheets, to step in and ensure that they have the flow of finance they need to not go bankrupt and just collapse. So all of these are measures that are, again, direct or indirect subsidies to actors on the supply side of the real estate sector. On the demand side, they have a different set of subsidies and supports. Local and national regulators are going to make home purchases easier. They're going to kind of ease some of the regulated aspects of the industry, specifically down payment thresholds and mortgage rate floors. So hypothetically, if you're a first-time buyer, it should get a little bit cheaper. So again, the point there is just to encourage more demand as best they can. Another item here, the other item that was on the demand side, they're going to ease purchasing rules more specifically for people who are, one, moving to a city for the first time, and two, who are first-time buyers. The pace of urbanization in China has slowed a bit as the economy has slowed down over the past 10 years, but there's still a lot of people coming from rural areas. And so helping them out is good politics, but it's also kind of a natural way to prevent support for the demand side from spiraling into support for a de facto bubble in the industry. If you just give support to everybody to help them buy housing, that's going to inflate a bubble. But this is a sufficiently narrow group that you can help encourage demand in the sector while at the same time hedge against inflating a bubble. This specific group is a little too specific and small to really threaten that. So you can see these are relatively targeted, smart subsidies directed at the demand side here. Again, just trying to goose demand here for real estate. So these are subsidies. They also took some measures as part of this plan that are obviously just targeted at protecting consumers. Mortgage lenders here are being encouraged to extend mortgage payments for people. If one, their property purchasing contracts have been changed or canceled, or two, they are unemployed specifically because of COVID. So this is just an effort here just to try to ensure that people don't lose their homes or go into default because of extenuating circumstances, of which there are more than a few right now in China's economy, if not the broader global economy. They've also said explicitly that consumer credit scores are to be protected. So what they're saying here is that they don't want anybody's credit rating to be destroyed because of all the drama in the real estate sector. A lot of people borrowed money to invest in the sector, to take part in these investment projects, and when a lot of them failed to materialize, the projects were incomplete and people couldn't recoup their money, that meant that they were unable to repay their loan, and people were afraid that their credit rating would take a hit correspondingly. So the government has now said just officially that if you are in that kind of position, your credit score will not be harmed. I don't know exactly how they're actually going to operationalize that in practice. The article didn't mention that, but apparently the government will try to make that a priority. And given how much power the Chinese government has, they probably will follow through on that, I expect. So let's see, some more targeted measures that are specifically designed to reinforce the real estate industry more generally. Lenders are going to be encouraged to facilitate mergers between the larger and more stable developers and the smaller and more unstable developers. Trust companies are also going to be encouraged to make funds available to developers for rental, construction, and retirement homes, but also more notably, mergers. So you can see here the government strategy kind of emerging here. You can see the outline of it. They're going to throw a lot of money at subsidies to try to shore up demand for the industry so that the industry has more money to work with on both the demand side and the supply side. But more specifically here, you can see that they're going to try to consolidate the industry under a few producers. And this is an interesting move because one of the debates that's been happening in China's public policy circles is whether or not the government should just nationalize the real estate industry. There was a lot of opposition to that, I suspect, from the liberal reformist faction within the party that would have basically it would have prevented the further evolution and emergence of a fully independent and efficient real estate sector. That basically would have been the Chinese government giving up and saying, this industry is not going to work by itself. It just needs to be controlled by the government. There's some merit to that position, the idea that it should be nationalized, but it would have a lot of significant long-term ramifications for the market. It would have introduced a lot of government corruption, and it would have prevented financial markets and other markets from having access to that market in a way that would have allowed them to continue to grow and be shaped by competitive forces rather than state forces. So in a sense, the reason that's relevant here is because this approach represents a kind of soft nationalization. The government is not going to take control of the industry directly, but it is going to push lenders and real estate firms basically to act in ways that are going to result in most of the industry being controlled by a relatively small number of producers that have stable balance sheets. That's not a bad way to do it. That'll stabilize the market if they can pull it off without any hiccups. Given how much corruption there is in China, there could well be hiccups. But if they can pull it off, the industry should be able to stabilize, and the government can kind of use these few de facto state-backed real estate actors as their avatars in the industry. And they can kind of finagle their balance sheets using lenders that are at the disposal of the Communist Party to try to get them in a position where they're stable and not in a position where they're just going to implode and self-destruct the entire construction industry in China. Once they do that, the fact that they've maintained these actors in nominally private hands means that they'll be able to relatively easily decentralize the industry once they're ready. Once the sector is stable, then they can start quote-unquote privatizing. Again, that's not really privatizing, but they can maybe apply anti-monopoly laws or apply pressure as needed or what have you to get these large real estate firms that are going to emerge, presumably. Again, this is somewhat speculation on my part, but I'm speculating here that these firms will come to a few firms will dominate the industry with state backing. And once the whole problem is kind of settled and the economy has kind of cooled off and become more sane, these select few firms will start to divest themselves of assets. They'll start selling off assets to other smaller firms so that the industry becomes less concentrated again, and so that market forces can restore their control over the course of the industry. So a little bit of nationalization and a little bit of market forces. It's a nice compromise, or at least that's the way it looks to me as an outside observer. It kind of looks to me like the hardliners in the party negotiated with the reformers and that this is what they got. And it seems pretty smart to me. I think they can make this work. So overall, I'd say this is relatively good quality policymaking on the part of the Chinese government. Although I would again add the caveat that the party and the government are so corrupt that they may not be able to actually operationalize all of this in practice. But even controlling for corruption, this seems like it should be able to arrest the decline in the real estate sector and shore up the construction industry such that the manufacturing sector will not just implode. So at the very worst, we're looking at stagnation in the Chinese economy, given that they've chosen this course. Again, stability in the short term at the cost of long-term, at the cost of a long-term lack of productivity in the Chinese economy. Because again, the trade-off is that they're focusing on the short term over and above dealing with the productivity problem. And without dealing with that, China's economy is going to start to stagnate. They've already kind of moved in that direction. The growth of China's economy has declined steadily over the past 10 years. And at this point, it's looking like it's just going to kind of flatline. It won't shrink per se, but it's not going to grow either. It's going to be like Japan after the property bust back in the 80s. It's just going to kind of exist for a while without doing much.
It's not doing well, but it does exist.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll see whether or not I'm right or wrong, but I think overall things should be okay in China. Lots of good news today.
Yeah, I like that. That's a refreshing change of pace from the weird and the chaotic.
Yeah. Forces of chaos seem to be in the decline. Knock on wood. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, how are we on time? I think that took up most of that 30 minutes.
Yeah, I'm in a match, so if you want to do flags or something.
Oh,
Where
yeah.
you're at. That's cool.
What have we got? Let's see. Got a couple from Bulgaria. It's always fun. I think we've had a couple pretty consistently for a while now. Thank you for listening. We have one from Belgium. Belgium's flag always trips me up because I see it and I immediately think, oh, that's Germany. And then I have to do a double take and, oh, right,
Yeah.
it's not, it's different. Horizontal versus vertical stripes, basically. Got somebody from Israel. If you're from Israel and listening, I'd love to hear your opinion on the recent elections, assuming you didn't already share during the earlier part of the segment when we were talking about it. One from Colombia. How's the new government in Colombia doing? Well, I should say the new president. I haven't heard from him in a while, so I'm a little curious. Let's see, you got one from Ukraine. Oh, welcome. Congrats on the recent gains. I'm just hoping they can keep it up. Let's see. Hungary, one. Don't think I've heard too much from Hungary lately. They've been weirdly quiet. I'm sure they'll change that at the first opportunity. Got 3 Russians listening. Thank you for tolerating us. It's been getting a little dicey in Russia recently. The government's been cracking down more.
Yeah, I've heard some people who I know are in Russia talk about it, and they've listened to this segment because it's like a way that they can hear what outside of Russia is saying about the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So it's intriguing in that sense.
Ah, gotcha. Well, here's hoping the government lightens up soon.
Our
2
Israeli
from
viewer
Mexico.
said they didn't share. They voted for Lapid, but they knew Netanyahu's going to win.
Ah, gotcha. Yeah, it was pretty up in the air. I felt from what I read before the election. I hadn't thought it would. I hadn't thought it was that certain, but yeah, it seems he was right. He did end up winning. We had 2 from Mexico listening. I wanted to ask them, how do you feel about President Obrador? He's been in office for a while now, and he's definitely been pretty bold in some of the stuff he's done, but I don't know how much it's really helped. So I'd be curious to hear a Mexican opinion on the president there. He doesn't make the news much. Latin America in general doesn't make the news much, especially here in the US. So it's always good to hear a firsthand account from there. One from Moldova. It's always a surprise to see Moldova on here. Thank you for listening. Hopefully things aren't too crazy. There's always something going on in Moldova, it seems. I remember one of the weirdest stories, I guess not weirdest, but one of the biggest corruption stories I ever read was there was a guy working in the Moldovan Central Bank who just straight up stole like billions of dollars and then left the country. Like from the central bank. Just stole it. It's one of the wilder ones.
Did he have a huge bag with all the money in it, or a digital transfer of some kind?
It had to have been digital, I would imagine. But who's to say?
Who's that guy with the giant Santa Claus bag walking out of the bank? Oh, he was just withdrawing from his account.
Yeah. What else did we have? One Finland. Yeah, Turkey is still holding up the accession of Sweden and Turkey, or rather Sweden and Finland to NATO. So that's still kind of undecided. I had thought that would be progressing more quickly than it is, but I think Erdogan and the AKP in Turkey are taking the opportunity to try to look strong. The AKP hasn't been polling as well, and they have an election next year, so they've been engaging in a lot of posturing of one sort or another.
Mm.
One from Argentina. That's probably Dagnup. Hello, Dagnup.
Yep.
Still working on the email. I'll get back to you.
Yep, he's here.
Let's see. I think that's most everybody. One from Poland. One from New Zealand.
Oh, I had a random question based on something we were discussing earlier.
Sure.
So for elections and voting, a lot of times you're in a region, say a state in the US, for example, and you have a person in mind you want to vote for, but you know that you're in a state where it's like a landslide state, not a battleground state, where your side's basically never going to win. What is the value of you still engaging in the voting system as an individual, or is there one?
When you say engaging in the voting system, what do you mean? Do you mean like running for office
No,
or
just-
voting in general?
Yeah, just sending a vote.
If you know that your preferred candidate is going to lose?
Yeah. Say you're in the most progressive state in the country or the most conservative state in the country, you vote for the opposite side, you're going to lose. Is there still value?
Yes, there's still value because it's not as though we only vote for one election at a time. You know, there's other stuff on the ballot that you probably can influence, even if there are some races that you can't influence. So it's definitely still worth showing up to participate in American democracy. You know, people tend to overly fixate on the national races, but it's actually the local races that are a lot more impactful as far as how politics impacts your day-to-day life. So yeah, definitely still show up.
Oh yeah, Fuzzy
no-
Bird's pointing out there's ballot measures that you can vote on too. That's a good point.
Ah, yeah, that as well. Good point. Yeah, I mean, just because your preferred party isn't very strong in a given area, you can still have a big influence, especially at a local area. And it's still worthwhile too. You may not be able to vote for a candidate you like, but you can still vote for a candidate you prefer. You know, you can prevent the guy that's worse than the guy you don't like from getting into power. So that's at least something that you can get out of it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I remember you saying in a previous discussion we had that if you want actual tangible change that you can see, it's best to work from a local position rather than hope to like change something at the national level. So if you can talk to your mayor or someone who has a say in other places of policy and legislation, and you as a local like constituent of them let them know like, hey, this is a big issue for us, then that has a higher chance of making something move than just screaming on Twitter.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a more challenging question would be, why would you run for a party in an election in which you have no chance in winning? Like, who does that?
Vermin Supreme.
Vermin Supreme. Beto O'Rourke, perhaps, depending. I mean, I think the answer there is that the idea is that you try to get as close to the median as you can, like the median voter in whatever constituency you're running for. So even if most people in that area may run or may vote straight ticket, basically, it may be that if you moderate your politics enough and try to give a message that you can improve on things that people like genuinely do have issues with, basically promise to do everything the same, but just do things better. That's not very ideologically satisfying, but you could actually win doing that. And that's how you end up with a lot of centrist Republicans or centrist Democrats winning in areas where where you would not necessarily expect those parties to do well. So in so much as that actually does happen, you know, that itself can make it worth voting in an election where your party may not win. You know, if you've got good candidates who maybe are running for the wrong party, so to speak, but if they're running a good campaign and they're trying to do a good job of being an outsider candidate, targeting the median, they should still have a chance, hypothetically. So that could make it worthwhile too if you are just fixated on that one particular race. But not every constituency gets candidates like that. Some people just run knowing they're going to lose because they want to get their name in the paper. You know, it's not necessarily a fame thing. It's more about building recognition. You know, you want people to know who you are when you run for something else that maybe you actually have a chance of winning.
Yeah, you're probably going to run at least a couple times as a losing candidate before you get enough handshakes in there that you're a contender to be a winning candidate.
Yeah, you know, Beto O'Rourke maybe is a good example of that. Like, he's never won an election, at least not a gubernatorial election, but everybody knows his name now. Like, if you wanted to run for Senate, which, you know, he also did, or maybe for something else, he might have a better chance there. So he's got a good brand recognition. He's got good brand recognition going at this point. And of course, he was able to kind of mobilize the Democratic base a little bit. So, you know, there was something to be said for that as well. Sometimes people don't run at all. Sometimes in the United States, we actually have offices where there's just one party that runs, and nobody runs against them because nobody actually expects to win against them, which can sometimes be inadvertently hilarious. Because there was an election in Chicago some years ago. I remember reading about this. There was an election in Chicago. The Democratic candidate was just known. It was known he was going to win. And so the Republican Party did not even nominate anybody to run for that particular seat. And I think this was like a local election or something, or maybe a state election. So what happened is that one of the local neo-Nazis decided to run. And he decided to run as a Republican. So he came out and said, hey, I'm a neo-Nazi, vote Republican. Which, as you can imagine, is really, really terrible marketing for the Republican Party. And it's not what they wanted. And the reason I bring that up is that it's specifically to avoid that kind of scenario, that sometimes a party will run a candidate in a district in which they know they're going to lose. Sometimes it's not about realistically challenging the other party. Sometimes it's just about protecting the brand from the psychos and radicals who might try to fill the vacuum if you don't do anything.
So participation does seem to have some values, even if you're not a contender to win. And then for people who are in the younger age bracket, which is younger than being a senior citizen, we're basically like the secret hidden vote factor. Old people, they vote in droves. That's one of the things that the political parties can rely on, but they never suspect some random 35-year-old to go show up and vote. That's how we get them.
Yeah, the youth vote is very unpredictable. You know, when they turn out, they can definitely have a big influence, and they certainly did in the midterms recently. We'll see if it sticks. You know, generally, the youth vote trends Democratic, but people also kind of change their political affiliation as they get older. Sometimes people get more conservative. Sometimes that's in absolute terms, as in they just kind of shift their ideological predilections or their interests change or whatever, such that they want to vote for the Republican Party. Sometimes it's actually more of a relative change, because the parties themselves change position over time. So it could be that a position that was once considered conservative, well, it could be that a position that was once considered liberal becomes conservative over time. So you may not change your position on something, but how the parties stand on that particular issue may change, such that you end up voting for a different party correspondingly. So somebody may become more conservative in that sense as well. So we'll see if this trend of youth voter turnout and their predilection for the Democratic Party actually is a trend, or if it's just some weird anomaly that's a function of the weird circumstances that come with living in the 2020s.
We'll see, but it's refreshing to have a episode this week with some heckin' good news for a change. People putting slightly more faith in institutions, being slightly less polarized. Wow.
Yeah, the broad macro trends in the world seem to be on an uptick.
What's next? People using their inside voices when they talk to each other? It's getting out of hand.
Let's not be overly ambitious.
Fair enough.
Small victories and whatnot.
Well, thank you for coming on as always. Thank you for Fuzzy Cord for handling questions and chat for participating. If we messed anything up in this episode, feel free to yell at us in the YouTube comments. This will be on YouTube. And we will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah. Thanks again for having me. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG. Nice.